At dinner, my husband whispered to me to transfer his entire $50 million fortune to my account, just to be safe. He died 36 hours later. Then, his son and daughter-in-law showed up with a lawyer and said, "I'm Elena, I'm 34 years old, and right now I am sitting in a cheap motel with a dead husband and a pending $50 million wire transfer that could either save my life or send me to a federal penitentiary." Just 36 hours ago, my husband Richard leaned over our dining table, gripped my wrist so hard it left a bruise, and told me to transfer his entire fortune immediately because his own son and daughter-in-law were trying to destroy him. Then he dropped dead, and before his body was even cold, they showed up at the hospital with an attorney and an eviction notice, accusing me of murder and theft. Before I continue this story, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with toxic in-laws who underestimated your worth and tried to rewrite your history. The nightmare began on an ordinary Thursday evening. Richard and I were sitting in the private formal dining room of our estate, a historic mansion nestled in the affluent Pacific Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. Outside, a classic Northern California winter storm was battering the floor-to-ceiling windows, throwing sheets of freezing, foggy rain against the glass. Richard had spent the last 20 years building a global tech logistics empire, a Silicon Valley-based company that processed millions of international shipments a day. He was 58 years old, full of life, and the most brilliant man I had ever met. But that night, he looked exhausted. His skin had a strange, grayish pallor that sent an immediate shiver down my spine. I was serving the dry-aged ribeye when his steak knife suddenly clattered against the fine bone china. I looked up in alarm. Richard was clutching his chest. His breathing was heavy and shallow. "Richard, what's wrong?" "Let me call 911, I insisted, already reaching for the iPhone in my pocket. He lunged across the table and grabbed my wrist. His grip was terrifyingly weak, his palms sweaty and cold. "There's no time," Richard gasped, his chest heaving as he fought for air. "Listen to me very carefully. Open my encrypted drive. Transfer the entire $50 million from the Alpha Fund to your hidden offshore account. Do it right now, Elena, just as a precaution. Don't let Connor or Vanessa find out, especially Vanessa. Richard collapsed onto the dark hardwood floor before he could finish his sentence. Panic seized me. I dropped to my knees beside him, screaming his name, my hands frantically pressing on his chest to start CPR. I managed to call emergency services, my voice shaking as I gave the 911 dispatcher our address. While the sirens wailed in the distance, I looked back at the dining table. Richard's MacBook was open. The access codes for the hidden Alpha Fund were scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper next to his plate. As a former forensic accountant, I had spent the first 10 years of my career chasing corporate embezzlers, tracking hidden assets, and unraveling complex financial scams for major Wall Street firms in Manhattan. I knew Richard's ledgers inside and out. There was no Alpha Fund in his public books. $50 million in liquid cash doesn't just appear unnoticed unless it is intentionally being hidden. But seeing my husband's pale, motionless face on the floor, I didn't care about the legality. I cared about his survival. I opened the laptop, punched in the encrypted passcodes, and initiated the wire transfer to my private account. Because it was an international transfer of an astronomical sum, the banking protocol triggered an automatic security hold. The screen blinked. Transfer pending. Final approval in 48 hours. The paramedics came bursting through the front doors and rushed Richard to the emergency room. The next 36 hours became a blur of sterile waiting rooms, the clinical antiseptic smell, and sheer, suffocating grief. Richard never regained consciousness. He lay in the intensive care unit, hooked up to a dozen tubes and monitors, his heart fading with every passing hour. I sat by his bed, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face in the dim room as I checked the transfer status over and over again. The banking app displayed the same message. Transfer pending. Approval in 12 hours. I reached out, wrapping his cold fingers in mine. "I did it, Richard," I whispered into the quiet room, tears spilling over my lashes. "The money is moving. It's pending. Just please hold on. You have to wake up." When Richard and I got married 2 years ago, San Francisco's high society tore me apart. They called me a gold digger, a trophy wife who had set her sights on a wealthy older man. I was 34, and Richard was 24 years my senior. His son, Connor, who was only 3 years younger than me, had completely boycotted our wedding, refusing to even look at me. Connor's wife, Vanessa, an incredibly sharp and ambitious woman, had climbed the corporate ladder to become the chief financial officer of Richard's company. She attended the wedding, but her smile was cold and calculating. They both saw me as a threat to their inheritance, an outsider who had crashed their ready-made empire. They had no idea that I had been pulling in a highly successful six-figure salary as a forensic auditor before retiring early to support Richard after his first minor stroke. I didn't need his money. I just wanted a quiet life with the man I loved. But as I sat next to his hospital bed, the monitors suddenly began to shriek. A high-pitched, piercing, uninterrupted tone filled the ICU room, shattering the silence. The green line on the cardiac screen went completely flat. Code blue. We need a crash cart in Bay 4, stat, a nurse shouted, throwing the door open. Medical staff swarmed the bed, pushing me back against the cold drywall. I watched in paralyzing horror as they charged the defibrillator paddles, their voices a chaotic blend of emergency commands. Clear! Richard's body jerked violently upward. Clear! The paddles slammed into his chest again. Nothing happened. The flatline remained. Time of death, 11:42 p.m., the attending physician announced softly, lowering his hands. He turned to look at me, his eyes full of professional compassion. I am so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sterling. The room began to spin. The man who had been my anchor, my protector, was gone. I sank into the chair, my mind completely numb, until my eyes fell on my laptop sitting on the wheeled medical tray. The screen was still on, transfer pending. Approval in 10 hours. Richard's final, desperate words echoed in my mind with sudden, terrifying clarity. Don't let Connor or Vanessa find out. Especially Vanessa. I slammed my laptop shut and shoved it into my tote bag just as the waiting room door banged open. It had been exactly 3 hours since Richard took his last breath. I was sitting in the private family waiting room down the hall from the ICU. I hadn't changed clothes. My silk cream blouse was severely wrinkled, bearing a faint rust-colored stain from Richard's blood when I had desperately tried to give him chest compressions at home. My hands were tightly clasped in my lap. I was staring blankly at the ugly floral pattern of the hospital carpet, trying to process the absolute collapse of my entire world. The heavy oak doors of the waiting room swung open with a violent thud. Connor walked in first. He was wearing a tailored navy suit without a single hair out of place. There was no redness in his eyes, no tremble in his lips. He looked like he was walking into a hostile board meeting rather than the hospital ward where his father had just died. Right behind him was Vanessa. She was flawless in a sleek charcoal blazer, her posture rigid and authoritative. As a fiercely intelligent woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry, she was entirely accustomed to dominating every room she entered. As the CFO of Richard's logistics empire, she wielded her power with ruthless efficiency. She carried a sleek leather briefcase, her designer heels clicking ominously against the linoleum floor. Trailing behind them was a man I recognized immediately. Garrison was a notorious probate litigator in the Bay Area, known for gutting estates and leaving widows with pennies. Connor, I whispered, standing up, my voice cracking from pure exhaustion. I am so sorry. He's gone. Connor didn't offer a hug, nor did he offer a basic word of comfort. He stopped 2 feet away from me. His jaw was tight. Where's the laptop, Elena? I froze. The heavy grief that had been suffocating me was suddenly pierced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. What? Don't play dumb with me, Connor sneered, his voice dropping to a menacing register. The company laptop. The one he kept in the private study. Where is it? Your father just died 3 hours ago, Connor. He hasn't even been moved to the morgue. And you are asking me about a computer? Vanessa stepped forward smoothly, placing herself between her husband and me. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy. It was a mask of cold, calculating authority. Elena, let's not make this difficult, Vanessa said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. Richard was a sick man. His mental faculties were clearly in decline over the last few weeks. As CFO, I noticed several unauthorized, highly irregular transaction requests originating from his private terminal. We are here to secure company assets. He had a stroke, Vanessa. Not dementia. I fired back, my shock rapidly transmuting into fierce defensive anger. His mind was perfectly lucid until the very end. And since when does a CFO bring a predatory probate lawyer to a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m.? I shot a furious glare at Sterling, who simply adjusted his silk tie with a smug, knowing smirk. Since the moment we realized you were taking advantage of a dying man, Connor snapped, stepping closer, towering over me. Did you think we wouldn't know? We tracked the IP pings. We know a wire transfer was initiated tonight. $50 million, Elena. $50 million. Did you honestly think you could loot my father's estate while he literally took his dying breaths? My blood ran cold. They knew about the transfer. But how? Richard had used a heavily encrypted ghost server, unless Vanessa had keyloggers installed on the company's internal network. As CFO, she had the security clearance to monitor back-channel financials. My forensic accountant instincts flared. She had been illegally monitoring his private movements. That transfer was initiated by Richard, not me, I said, keeping my voice completely level. I refused to let them see me tremble. He knew exactly what he was doing. Oh, please. Vanessa laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the sterile walls. She unlatched her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She threw them onto the glass coffee table between us. You are 34 years old. You haven't held a real job in 5 years. You spent your days redecorating the Pacific Heights mansion and attending charity galas on my father-in-law's dime. Do you think any judge in the state of California is going to believe that a corporate titan voluntarily transferred $50 million to a hidden account just hours before dropping dead? She leaned in, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute venom. It is a textbook case of undue influence, Elena. Elder financial abuse. Elder abuse? I gasped, stepping back as if I had been physically struck in the face. I loved him. I took care of him when he had his first stroke last year. Where were you two? You were skiing in Aspen, Connor. I was the one who fed him, rehabilitated him, helped him learn how to walk again. And you were compensated quite well for your nursing services, Connor retorted, his lip curling with absolute disgust. You got to live in a $15 million house and play Grand Dame of San Francisco. But the free ride is over. Cancel the transfer. Elena. Do it now. The transfer is pending, I said, my forensic training completely overriding my emotional devastation. It clears in less than 12 hours, and I won't touch it. Richard wanted it moved, and I am going to honor his last wish. Sterling, the lawyer, finally stepped forward. He pulled a single, terrifyingly official-looking document from his inside pocket. Mrs. Elena, I strongly suggest you reconsider your current stance. This is an ex parte emergency court order signed by a Superior Court judge 1 hour ago. We woke him up specifically for this occasion. It immediately freezes all assets belonging to Richard's estate. It also completely revokes your access to any marital funds, joint accounts, or company resources until a full probate investigation is concluded. I stared at the thick legal paper. They had already gone to a judge. While I was holding my dying husband's hand and begging him to stay with me, they were actively destroying my legal standing and financial security. You can't do this, I whispered. It's already done, Vanessa said smoothly. She reached down, picking up the court order and pressing it directly against my chest. You are a socially inept gold-digging anomaly in this family, Elena. We tolerated you because Richard demanded it. But now he is dead. Connor leaned in so close I could smell the stale black coffee on his breath. Don't send it, Elena. If that money clears, we will have you arrested for wire fraud by sunrise. Now, hand over the house keys. The keys? I repeated, my voice hollow. I looked from Connor to Vanessa, then to Sterling, hoping this was some kind of twisted, grief-induced nightmare. You're kicking me out of my own home? At 3 a.m.? My husband's body is still warm down the hall. It's not your home, Sterling interrupted smoothly, using his slick courtroom voice. The Pacific Heights estate was purchased by Richard prior to your marriage. It is held in a revocable trust of which Connor is the primary beneficiary. Given the pending allegations of elder financial abuse and the attempted unauthorized transfer of $50 million, my clients have a fiduciary duty to secure the premises immediately to prevent the destruction of evidence. I have a legal right of survivorship. I shot back, my forensic knowledge flashing to the forefront. You cannot execute a unilateral eviction without a formal 30-day notice regardless of the trust structure. I know the law, Sterling. Vanessa smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the predatory baring of teeth. You know accounting law, Elena. Not probate litigation. Read the court order. She tapped her manicured nail against the document I was holding. Page 3, paragraph 4. The judge granted an immediate emergency eviction order due to flight risk and the potential tampering of estate assets. You have exactly 0 rights right now. I looked down at the document. The bold black text blurred before my eyes. But Vanessa was right. A judge really had signed this. They had framed me as a desperate, thieving gold digger trying to abscond with $50 million in the middle of the night. Vanessa stepped closer, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy designed entirely to mock me. It's really sad, Elena. Richard was vulnerable. His mind was deteriorating, and you took advantage of his condition. Everyone saw how you isolated him after his first stroke. You banned us from visiting. You manipulated his diet and his medications. You engineered this entire scenario to enrich yourself. You know that's a lie, I snapped, my fists clenching at my sides. I was the one nursing him back to health while you and Connor were busy upgrading your luxury cars and draining his expense accounts. I isolated him because his doctor said your constant demands for money were spiking his blood pressure. Connor scoffed, taking a menacing step toward me. Save your breath. The narrative is already set. We have witness statements from the household staff. They are ready to testify that you verbally abused him and forced him to sign financial powers of attorney. You're going to look like a monster in front of the entire city. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice finally cracking beneath the immense cruelty of their coordinated attack. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, a tote bag with my encrypted laptop and a few credit cards. That sounds like a personal problem, Connor said, crossing his arms. Maybe call one of those charity friends you loved throwing my dad's money at. Hand over the keys, Elena. And the corporate credit cards. Now, my hands shook violently as I unzipped my tote bag. I pulled out the heavy brass keys to the house I had shared with Richard for 5 years. The house where we had painstakingly renovated the kitchen together. The house where he had collapsed just hours before. I dropped them onto the glass table. They landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. I pulled out the black corporate Amex cards and tossed them down too. You will pay for this, Connor, I whispered, looking my stepson dead in the eye. Richard knew. He knew exactly what you two were doing behind his back. That's why he wanted the money moved tonight. A nervous tick flickered in Connor's eye, a microscopic crack in his arrogant facade. He was a sick, confused old man. He didn't know anything. I suggest you vacate the premises, Sterling said, checking his expensive watch. Estate security has already been notified to deny you entry. If you attempt to access the property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Vanessa leaned in, dropping her voice so only I could hear. Listen to me very carefully, little girl. You are completely out of your depth. Cancel the wire transfer, walk away quietly, and maybe we won't press criminal charges for the theft. But if you try to fight us, I promise you, I will make sure you spend the best years of your youth in a federal penitentiary. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked out of the family waiting room. The hospital corridors felt miles long. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sickly hue over the linoleum. I walked out through the sliding automatic doors into the freezing San Francisco night. The rain was coming down in sheets, icy and relentless. I didn't have a jacket, and I didn't have a car, since the vehicle I drove was registered in the company's name. I was completely and utterly isolated. I stood under the hospital awning, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened my banking app. Access denied. Account frozen. I tried my personal savings account. The one I had since, before the marriage. Access denied. Account frozen. Vanessa hadn't just frozen the estate. She had aggressively frozen my personal assets under the guise of the ongoing fraud investigation. I was a billionaire's widow standing in the rain with exactly $42 in cash in my wallet. I hailed a cheap cab, giving the driver the address of a rundown motel near SFO Airport. It was the only place I could afford for the night. As the cab splashed through the flooded streets, the tears finally came. I cried for Richard. I cried for the cruel, sudden emptiness of my life. I cried for the sheer indignity of being tossed onto the street like garbage. But when the cab pulled up under the flickering neon glow of the cheap motel, the tears stopped. I paid the driver, walked into the dingy lobby, and paid for one night. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach. The bedspread was a questionable shade of brown. I threw the deadbolt, fastened the security chain, and sat down at the wobbly laminate desk in the corner of the room. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my tote bag and flipped it open. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark, damp room. I logged into the secure banking portal through my multi-layer VPN. The transfer screen was still active. $50,340,000. Status: pending. Time to approval: 10 hours and 14 minutes. Vanessa thought she had checkmated me. She thought she was dealing with a trophy wife who only knew how to pick out draperies and plan catering menus. She didn't realize that before I became a wife, I was a forensic auditor. I was the woman who personally dismantled a $300 million Ponzi scheme in Manhattan. I took apart complex financial structures for breakfast. If Richard wanted this money moved, there was a reason. And if Vanessa was willing to forge an emergency court order in the middle of the night to stop it, there was a massive, bloody secret buried in those corporate accounts. "You want a war, Vanessa?" I whispered to the empty room, my fingers flying across the keyboard to open a terminal window. "Let's see exactly how well you hid your tracks." I didn't cancel the transfer. Instead, I started digging. The wobbly laminate desk creaked under the weight of my forearms as I launched my decryption software. The motel room was freezing. The heating unit in the corner rattled loudly, spitting out lukewarm air that smelled of ozone and dust. I pulled my knees to my chest to retain body heat. My eyes were completely locked on the scrolling lines of code across my monitor. As a forensic accountant, I knew that money never simply disappears. It leaves a trail, a digital fingerprint. You just have to know where to look. I started with the routing numbers Richard had hastily scrawled on that crumpled piece of paper during his final moments. The $50 million transfer was currently sitting in digital purgatory, waiting for the 8-hour approval protocol to expire. Vanessa and Connor were certain they had locked me out. They assumed freezing my personal bank accounts and stripping me of my credit cards would cripple me. They wanted me destitute, terrified, and begging for a settlement. They severely underestimated my endurance. My stomach growled violently, a harsh reminder that I hadn't eaten since the steak dinner before Richard collapsed. I glanced at my wallet resting near the mousepad. $2. That was my entire net worth at this precise moment. I left the laptop running its tracing protocol and went down to the motel lobby to use the vending machine. I bought a stale granola bar and a bottle of water, paying with a crumpled dollar bill. When I swiped my personal debit card on the lobby coffee dispenser just to test it, the machine flashed a harsh, red, declined message. Vanessa had been incredibly thorough. She had weaponized the legal system overnight, effectively erasing my financial existence. I returned to my room, throwing the deadbolt. I tore open the granola bar, chewing mechanically while staring at the screen. The tracing program had hit a firewall. The Alpha Fund wasn't a standard corporate investment account. It was protected by military-grade encryption, the kind typically used by offshore shell companies to hide illicit activities. Richard was an upright logistics CEO. He despised shady financial practices. If his money was wrapped in this kind of digital armor, it meant someone else had built the fortress. Someone with the technical and financial expertise to bypass standard audits. Someone exactly like his CFO. Vanessa. My phone suddenly buzzed on the desk, shattering the quiet focus of the room. It wasn't a text message. It was an avalanche of social media alerts. My phone buzzed again, and then again, vibrating continuously, until it threatened to slide off the edge of the desk. I picked it up, frowning in confusion. Connor had just gone live on all major social media platforms. I tapped the notification, opening his video. Connor was sitting in the center of the frame, looking impeccably groomed but just disheveled enough to sell the image of a grieving son. His eyes were red. He had clearly rubbed them to simulate tears. Behind him, the grand fireplace of the Pacific Heights mansion provided a wealthy, sympathetic backdrop, the very same mansion I had been evicted from just hours ago. Early this morning, my family suffered an unimaginable tragedy, Connor told the camera, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. My father, a man who built a logistics empire from the ground up, passed away suddenly. We are completely devastated, but our grief has been compounded by a horrific betrayal. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. Connor looked directly into the lens, his expression hardening into righteous fury. My father's new wife, a woman significantly younger than him, attempted to steal $50 million from our family business, while he literally took his last breaths in the hospital. We caught her initiating the wire transfer from his private terminal. She took advantage of a sick, vulnerable man. We have immediately secured emergency court orders to freeze all assets and removed her from the family estate to protect my father's legacy. She is currently being investigated by authorities for elder financial abuse. He paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Please respect our privacy as we navigate this profound loss and seek justice for my father. The video ended. I sat completely paralyzed for 10 seconds. Beneath the video, the comment section was an absolute bloodbath. In a matter of minutes, the post had racked up thousands of shares. Local San Francisco news outlets were already picking up the broadcast, broadcasting Connor's allegations on the morning news networks. The public response was ruthless. People who had never met me were calling me a sociopath, gold digger, murderer. Anonymous accounts were demanding my immediate arrest. Former country club acquaintances were posting comments claiming they always knew I was a fraud. My reputation was being publicly executed in real time. Connor and Vanessa were controlling the narrative, painting me as a predator to hide their own crimes. They knew that if the public condemned me, law enforcement would scrutinize me even harder, making it impossible for me to defend myself against the impending criminal charges. A sharp ping from my laptop pulled my attention away from the toxic wasteland of my phone. The tracing protocol had finally punched through the first layer of the firewall. Lines of data flooded the screen, revealing the destination coordinates of the hidden funds. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the digital ledger. The anger coursing through my veins sharpened my focus into a deadly weapon. I didn't cry over the vicious comments. I didn't panic over the frozen bank accounts. The public smear campaign was nothing but a smokescreen, designed to distract me from the truth. I highlighted a specific block of transactions originating from the Alpha Fund. The money hadn't been stagnant. Millions of dollars had been methodically bled from Richard's logistics company. Incredible. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes scanning the digital ledger with predatory focus. The money hadn't just been siphoned in a few large chunks. It had been systematically and meticulously drained through thousands of small transactions. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was a highly sophisticated corporate bleed-out designed to evade standard automated banking alerts and internal audit triggers. As a forensic accountant, I recognized the methodology instantly. It was a classic technique known as smurfing, where massive amounts of capital are broken down into seemingly innocuous payments to bypass federal reporting thresholds. Someone had been siphoning funds under the guise of routine operational expenses for Richard's logistics company, and that someone had the highest level of administrative clearance. I cracked my knuckles and launched my proprietary tracing software. This was a program I had personally coded during my years working on Wall Street, specifically designed to unravel layered financial obfuscation. I typed in the primary routing numbers Richard had hastily written on that crumpled napkin. The software sprang to life, casting a stark blue light across the dingy motel walls. A progress bar crawled across the screen. As the program began mapping the financial web, pinging offshore servers and bypassing superficial security walls. While the software ran its aggressive algorithms, I pulled up the public financial disclosures of Richard's company. I needed a baseline to compare against the hidden Alpha Fund data. According to the official quarterly report signed by Vanessa as CFO, the company was operating on a modest, stable profit margin. Operational costs had supposedly spiked over the last 4 years due to international shipping tariffs and supply chain disruptions. It was a perfectly plausible narrative for investors and board members. But looking at the raw data pouring into my hidden terminal, I saw the absolute lie hiding beneath her glossy spreadsheets. Operational costs weren't rising because of global tariffs. They were rising because Vanessa was paying ghost vendors. The software finally generated a visual map of the routing numbers. A complex spiderweb of interconnected nodes appeared on my screen. I clicked on the first cluster of transactions. Millions of dollars had been routed to a shipping entity registered in Delaware. I cross-referenced the corporate registry database. The Delaware LLC had no physical address, no fleet of trucks, no payroll records. It was a shell company, a phantom entity existing solely on paper to generate fake invoices. Vanessa had been approving millions in payouts to this ghost vendor for non-existent freight services. From there, the money bounced. It moved from Delaware to a holding company in Panama. Then it fractured into a dozen different accounts in Switzerland before consolidating again. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. She was using her position to authorize payments, bypassing internal audits, using obscure accounting loopholes, and essentially robbing her father-in-law blind. But Richard had caught her. The Alpha Fund wasn't a slush fund he had set up to hide his wealth from me or the government. The Alpha Fund was a trap. Richard must have discovered the embezzlement during his recovery from his first stroke, when he had more time to review the raw operational data away from Vanessa's curated presentations. Instead of confronting her immediately and risking her destroying the evidence, he had quietly established the Alpha Fund. He had used his supreme executive override authority to claw back the stolen funds from the offshore accounts and trap them in a centralized, highly encrypted location. The $50 million was the physical proof of her monumental fraud. I needed to follow the final thread. I needed to see exactly whose name was attached to the end of the Panamanian routing chain. If I was going to destroy Vanessa and Connor, I needed irrefutable proof that they were the ultimate beneficiaries of the stolen wealth. I typed a rapid sequence of command lines, deploying a brute force packet sniffer to trace the encrypted handshakes between the Panamanian holding company and the final destination bank. The motel heater rattled violently in the corner, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. My entire existence was reduced to the blinking cursor on the black screen. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, watching the code unspool. "Give me the name. Show me the ultimate account holder." The screen flashed green, access granted. The final layer of encryption dissolved, revealing a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. I downloaded the trust's incorporation documents, my eyes darting across the digital pages. There it was, the smoking gun. The sole beneficiaries of the Cayman Trust were Connor and Vanessa. They had siphoned $50 million from Richard to build their own hidden empire. They were draining his life's work while smiling at him over Sunday dinners. Suddenly, a chilling realization washed over me. If Vanessa realized Richard had uncovered the fraud, she would have known her entire life was about to implode. Wire fraud of this magnitude carried a 2-0-year federal prison sentence. She would have lost everything: her wealth, her prestigious career, her freedom. Unless Richard died before he could blow the whistle. My hands began to shake, but not from fear. It was a cold, calculating rage. The sudden cardiovascular collapse, the fact that Connor and Vanessa were already prepared with a high-powered probate lawyer and emergency court orders just 3 hours after his death. They had orchestrated it. They had framed me for elder abuse to ensure I was completely discredited and removed from the property, preventing me from getting anywhere near his private servers. But they didn't know Richard had already handed me the keys. I stared at the pending transfer status on the screen. The $50 million was moving to my blind account. I had to redirect it tonight. My forensic mind had fully awakened. It was war. I stared at the blinking cursor, the stark reality of the situation washing over me like a bucket of ice water. The $50 million in the pending wire transfer wasn't my inheritance. It wasn't a generous parting gift from a loving husband wanting to secure my future. It was blood money. It was the physical manifestation of a massive criminal conspiracy, a digital confession of corporate treason orchestrated by the people Richard had trusted most. Vanessa and Connor hadn't just been stealing to fund their lavish lifestyle. They had been actively destroying the foundation of Richard's entire life's work. I opened a new command terminal and began compiling the evidence. Every forensic accountant knows that proving fraud requires more than just finding the destination account. You have to map the entire circulatory system of the theft. I needed to document exactly how Vanessa, in her role as CFO, had managed to bleed a highly regulated logistics empire dry without triggering a single external audit. I pulled up the digitized corporate ledgers I had backed up on my encrypted drive months ago. I cross-referenced the dates of the largest payouts to the phantom vendors against Vanessa's executive authorizations. The pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Vanessa had exploited a complex web of international shipping tariffs and exchange rate fluctuations. Every time the logistics company handled massive cross-border freight contracts, Vanessa artificially inflated the projected operational losses. She routed the excess capital through a secondary payment gateway, an obscure software interface she had personally mandated the company adopt 2 years ago. The interface acted as a financial centrifuge, shredding massive sums into thousands of microtransactions that slipped right under the automated compliance flags. Those microtransactions flowed directly to the Delaware Shell Company. From Delaware, the money was laundered through the Panamanian holding firm, a classic layering technique designed to break the chain of custody. Finally, it pooled in the master trust account in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Trust was an absolute fortress of financial secrecy. It was registered under a proxy director, but the underlying beneficiary documents I had just decrypted bore the digital signatures of Connor and Vanessa. They had built a perfect machine for corporate theft. But perfection always leaves a residue. The problem with stealing $50 million is the sheer weight of the capital. Moving that much money requires constant maintenance, constant authorization, and constant vigilance. Richard, despite his failing health, was a genius. He had noticed the discrepancies in the quarterly margins. He had seen the microscopic bleeding that the external auditors missed, and instead of confronting them immediately, he had quietly engineered a counteroffensive. He had used his supreme executive override codes to hijack the Panamanian routing chain, funneling the stolen wealth into his own encrypted alpha fund. He had essentially stolen his own money back from the thieves. That realization hit me with a profound sense of sorrow and awe. Richard had been fighting a silent war inside his own company, entirely alone, while his body failed him. He knew that calling the police immediately would trigger a massive public scandal, potentially destroying the logistics empire he had spent decades building. He needed absolute, irrefutable proof before making his move. He had corralled the $50 million as the final piece of evidence, and Vanessa must have realized the trap was closing. I leaned back in the flimsy motel chair, my mind racing through the timeline. 3 weeks ago, Richard's medication regimen was adjusted. Vanessa had been the one to recommend the new private concierge doctor, a supposedly elite physician who specialized in post-stroke cardiovascular care. I had trusted her recommendation. I had allowed that doctor into our home. I had administered the pills he prescribed. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She had orchestrated a medical assassination to protect her stolen fortune. The $50 million was the motive, the weapon, and the prize. And right now, that money was in transit to a blind account I controlled. Vanessa and Connor thought they had frozen my life by locking my personal bank accounts and throwing me onto the street. They assumed I was paralyzed by grief and poverty. They had no idea I held the digital leash to their entire criminal enterprise. The pending transfer was scheduled to clear in less than 10 hours. If the money landed in my account, Vanessa would twist the narrative. She would use the forged emergency court order to claim I had hacked the company servers and stolen the funds to flee the country. I couldn't let that happen. The money could not touch my personal accounts. If it did, I became an accessory to wire fraud in the eyes of the law, exactly as Vanessa planned. I needed to weaponize the $50 million. I needed to turn Richard's last protective measure into a devastating offensive strike. I opened my secure network protocols and began writing a custom routing script. I wasn't going to cancel the transfer. Canceling it would simply return the funds to the corporate ledger, allowing Vanessa to instantly bury the money back in the Cayman Islands and erase the digital paper trail forever. I had to redirect the transfer mid-flight. I needed a destination that Vanessa couldn't touch a vault. No probate lawyer or corrupt judge could freeze. I needed a federal depository account. My fingers flew across the keyboard, coding a bypass command that would intercept the $50 million the second it released from the banking hold. I was going to route every single penny of the blood money directly into the hands of the people who could dismantle Vanessa and Connor's lives permanently. I opened the encrypted contact file from my old accounting days in Manhattan. I was ready to execute this. I had to act now. Perfect. I opened a new workspace. The money alone proved the fraud. Connor and Vanessa could claim corporate negligence or blame a fall guy for the embezzlement. I needed to prove the murder. I had to connect the stolen money to Richard's sudden cardiovascular collapse. I accessed Richard's personal medical portal using the master passwords we shared. 3 weeks ago, Vanessa had aggressively pushed us to hire Dr. Arrington, a highly exclusive concierge physician. She claimed the company's executive health plan covered his exorbitant fee. At the time, I was so desperate for Richard to recover from his stroke that I accepted any elite medical intervention. Now, staring at the glaring white screen in the freezing motel room, I knew that decision had been a carefully orchestrated trap. I launched a deep dive investigation into Dr. Arrington. On the surface, he was impeccable. He boasted an Ivy League pedigree and a waiting list of billionaire clients. But forensic accounting is all about looking past the glossy exterior and finding the dirty plumbing underneath. I ran his medical partnership through my proprietary tracing software, looking for any financial overlap with Richard's logistics empire. The search algorithm churned for several tense minutes. The motel room felt completely silent, except for the frantic, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Then, a massive data cluster popped up on my monitor. Vanessa had indeed paid Dr. Arrington using the corporate executive health plan, but that was merely the public transaction. Peeling back the digital layers of the corporate expense accounts, I found a secondary, highly concealed ledger. Vanessa had authorized a separate $2 million consulting fee to a biomedical research firm registered in Belize. I ran the Belize entity through the Global Corporate Registry database. The registered agent for the firm was a proxy lawyer, but the principal shareholder was a holding company controlled directly by Dr. Arrington. My blood ran completely cold. Vanessa hadn't just hired a doctor. She had bought a professional hitman. I needed to establish the exact timeline of the murder. I opened the pharmacy dispensing logs attached to Richard's patient file. Dr. Arrington had completely overhauled Richard's daily medication regimen exactly 18 days ago. He had discontinued a standard, reliable blood thinner and replaced it with an obscure, highly potent experimental cardiovascular drug. The medical justification noted in his digital file was aggressive stroke prevention. Next, I pulled up the internal company logs, showing when Richard first accessed the corrupt Panamanian routing chains. Richard had initiated his own secret audit exactly 21 days ago. He had found the embezzlement, locked the stolen funds in the Alpha Fund, and was preparing to expose his son and daughter-in-law. 3 days later, Vanessa introduced us to Dr. Arrington. The sequence of events was terrifyingly precise. Vanessa realized Richard was closing in on her $50 million theft. She knew he possessed the power to destroy her lucrative life and send her to prison. She needed him silenced immediately. But it had to look like a natural tragedy. A man recovering from a major stroke suffering a fatal second heart attack wouldn't raise any red flags with standard medical examiners. It was the perfect, undetectable crime. I dug deeper into the specific medication Dr. Arrington had prescribed. I accessed restricted medical databases and pharmacological warning logs. The drug was notorious for causing sudden cardiac arrest if administered at a specific dosage to patients with a history of arterial damage. Dr. Arrington had deliberately prescribed a lethal dose, masking it as an aggressive preventative measure. He had handed Richard a loaded gun, and I had unwittingly helped him pull the trigger by giving my husband those poison pills every morning. A wave of profound sickness washed over me. I clamped my hand over my mouth, forcing myself to breathe through the overwhelming urge to vomit. They had weaponized my love and care for Richard into the very instrument of his death. Vanessa had orchestrated the entire thing with the cold, calculating precision of a master tactician. She used the embezzled funds to pay the assassin, utilized her authority as CFO to hide the transaction, and wielded the emergency probate court order to ensure I was thrown out of the house before I could secure the physical pill bottles for an independent toxicology screen. But she made a fatal mistake. She left a digital footprint. She believed her complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts was completely impenetrable. She assumed a grieving, 3-4-year-old widow would be too broken, too ignorant, and too terrified to look behind the curtain. She forgot I spent a decade tracking down the darkest financial crimes in the country. I aggressively compiled every piece of evidence. I pulled the wire transfers from the corporate ledger to the Delaware Shell Company. I pulled the routing data from Panama to the Cayman Islands. I captured the digital signatures proving Connor and Vanessa were the sole beneficiaries of the stolen $50 million. Then, I attached the medical payment logs linking Vanessa to the $2 million dirty money payout to Dr. Arrington. I bundled the entire devastating package into a single, heavily encrypted master file. This was no longer just a case of probate theft or simple embezzlement. It was a massive federal conspiracy to commit murder for ultimate financial gain. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 4 a.m. The pending $50 million wire transfer was scheduled to execute in just 8 hours. I had the explicit motive, I had the murder weapon, I had absolute proof of their guilt. I opened my secure communications protocol and loaded the contact information for Agent Miller. He was a lead investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar crime and corporate homicides. We had worked together on a massive case in Manhattan 5 years ago. He knew my work, and he trusted my forensic analysis implicitly. I typed a brief, urgent message, requesting a secure line. The trap was completely built. Vanessa and Connor thought they had buried Richard along with his secrets. They were about to find out that some secrets refused to stay buried. The harsh morning light filtered through the broken blinds of the motel room, signaling the start of a new day. My phone buzzed against the cheap laminate desk. It was an unsaved number, but the text message was unmistakable in its arrogant brevity. Meet us at the artisanal coffee shop on Market Street in 1 hour. Do not be late. We have a proposal for you. I stared at the screen, my heart beating a steady, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. Vanessa and Connor were getting restless. The pending $50 million wire transfer was inching closer to its approval deadline. They needed me to cancel the transfer before the banking hold expired, and they assumed a night in a freezing, run-down motel would have utterly broken my spirit. They wanted to negotiate my surrender. I quickly snapped my encrypted laptop shut, stowing it securely in my oversized leather tote. I splashed cold water on my face in the rusted bathroom sink, smoothing out the wrinkles in the silk blouse I had been wearing since Richard died. I looked exhausted, pale, and completely defeated. It was the perfect disguise. I hailed another cheap cab and headed to the upscale downtown coffee shop. The cafe was a favorite among San Francisco's corporate elite, featuring sleek marble countertops, modern brass fixtures, and a clientele dressed in tailored suits. I walked through the glass doors, feeling the immediate, judgmental stares of the patrons. I found an empty booth in the far corner and slid into the leather seat, clutching my tote bag tightly against my chest. Exactly 10 minutes later, Connor and Vanessa walked in. Vanessa dominated the room effortlessly. She wore a stunning emerald green sheath dress that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun. She projected absolute corporate dominance. Connor followed slightly behind her with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He looked like a man who had already won the war. They slid into the booth across from me. Neither of them ordered a coffee. This wasn't a friendly chat. This was an execution. "You look terrible, Elena," Connor remarked, leaning back against the leather cushion. "Reality finally hitting you? A cheap motel is a hell of a downgrade from the Pacific Heights estate." I hope the reality check was sufficiently uncomfortable. I kept my eyes down, intentionally avoiding his gaze to sell my performance of a broken widow. "What do you want, Connor?" I asked, letting my voice waver slightly. Vanessa took control immediately. She snapped open her designer briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it squarely in the center of the marble table and rested her manicured hands on top of it. "We are here to offer you a graceful exit," Vanessa said, her tone smooth and heavily patronizing. "We understand that losing Richard was a shock. We also understand that panic makes people do irrational things, like attempting to steal $50 million from a family business. But we are willing to be reasonable." She slid the envelope across the table until it touched my hands. "Open it." I flipped open the envelope flap. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me. The amount was exactly $1 million. Behind the check was a dense, multi-page legal document. "That is a standard non-disclosure agreement and a full waiver of your inheritance rights," Vanessa explained, watching my face intently for a reaction. "You sign that document, legally forfeiting any claim to Richard's estate, the house, and the company assets. You also agree to a permanent gag order regarding the events of last night. In exchange, you take that check, you cancel the pending wire transfer immediately, and you walk away." $1 million, I whispered, staring at the paper. "You're trying to buy my silence for $1 million. Don't act insulted," Connor scoffed, leaning forward. "It's $1 million more than you actually deserve. You should be thanking us on your knees." Vanessa held up a hand, silencing her husband. She leaned across the table, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "Let me make the alternative abundantly clear to you, Elena. If you refuse to sign that agreement, or if you refuse to cancel the wire transfer, I will personally ensure you are destroyed." She tapped a single, perfectly polished fingernail against the marble table. "Richard's autopsy report is currently pending. As you know, he suffered a fatal, sudden cardiovascular event. But what you don't know is that my legal team is prepared to file a formal request for a specialized toxicology screen. We have already informed the authorities about your concerning behavior over the last few weeks." My breath hitched. I didn't have to fake my shock. She was actually threatening to frame me for the murder she had orchestrated. "We will tell the police that you were the one managing his medications," Vanessa continued, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "We will allege that you intentionally administered a lethal overdose because you knew he was planning to divorce you. You were the only person alone with him when he collapsed. Combine that with your frantic attempt to wire $50 million to a hidden offshore account while he was dying, and any jury in the country will convict you of first-degree murder." "You wouldn't dare," I breathed, forcing my hands to tremble as I gripped the edge of the table. "Test me," Vanessa replied, her smile razor-thin and completely devoid of humanity. "I will bury you so deep in a federal penitentiary, you will forget what the sun looks like." "I hold all the cards, Elena. The company, the lawyers, the medical narrative. You have absolutely nothing. Take the $1 million and disappear, or spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell." Connor smirked, clearly enjoying the display of ruthless power. "Clock's ticking, Elena. The banking hold on that transfer expires tonight. We need your signature, and we need you to log into your portal and cancel the transfer right now." I looked at the check, then at the NDA. My mind was racing, processing the incredible arrogance sitting across from me. They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. Vanessa had essentially confessed her willingness to manipulate Richard's toxicology report, proving she had intimate knowledge of the exact poisoned pills Dr. Arrington had prescribed. She felt completely untouchable. I needed to give them a victory. I needed them to drop their guard and feel entirely secure so I could execute the trap I had built. I slumped my shoulders, letting a single tear slip down my cheek. I looked away, projecting absolute, total surrender. "Okay," I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. "You win. I'll sign it." Connor let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Smart girl. Finally realizing your place. But I can't cancel the transfer from here," I lied, looking back up at Vanessa with wide, fearful eyes. "The banking protocol requires me to be on a secure, authenticated network to reverse a transaction of that magnitude. If I try to do it on a public coffee shop network, the bank will freeze the account for suspicious activity, and the money will be locked in an investigative hold for months. I need to do it at the company office, or at the memorial service where I can access the encrypted family server." Vanessa narrowed her eyes, evaluating my statement. As CFO, she knew high-level wire transfers required strict security authentications. The lie was highly technical and entirely plausible. "Fine," Vanessa said, her tone sharp. "We are hosting a private memorial gathering for the board of directors and family tomorrow evening at the Fairmont. You will bring your laptop, you will sign the documents in front of our lawyer, and you will cancel the transfer on the secure network. If you try to run, the police will be waiting. I'll be there," I promised, wiping my face. "I just want this to be over." Vanessa stood up, smoothing her emerald dress. "Make sure you are on time, Elena. I hate being kept waiting." They turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving the $1 million check and the contract on the table. I watched them leave, maintaining my broken widow facade until they disappeared down the street. Then, I carefully folded the contract and slipped it into my tote bag. My tears dried instantly. The trap was set. Now I just had to prepare for the execution. I stepped out of the coffee shop into the biting San Francisco wind, but I didn't hail a cab immediately. I needed to solidify the narrative Vanessa had constructed. If they were going to believe I was a defeated, terrified widow on the verge of a psychological collapse, I had to give them a performance worthy of an audience. Vanessa and Connor were undoubtedly having me followed. People who embezzle $50 million and orchestrate a cardiovascular assassination don't simply walk away and trust their victim to comply. They watch. They verify. I spotted a dark sedan idling across the street. Its tinted windows barely concealed the silhouette of a driver whose gaze was locked directly on me. Perfect. I deliberately slumped my shoulders, ruining my posture. I stumbled slightly as I walked down the sidewalk, making sure to pull my phone from my bag with visibly shaking hands. I needed Vanessa to be informed that I was spiraling. I dialed a number I had memorized from the legal documents Vanessa had thrown at me. Sterling, the probate lawyer. The line rang twice before his slick, arrogant voice answered. Sterling and Associates. "Sterling, it's Elena," I gasped, pitching my voice an octave higher and forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I injected pure, unadulterated panic into my tone. "Please, you have to talk to Vanessa. You have to make her understand I'm not trying to run. I'm terrified." There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear his smug satisfaction. "Calm down, Elena. Hysterics won't help your legal standing. Have you reviewed the settlement agreement? I'm looking at it right now, I sobbed, clutching the phone tightly to my ear while stealing a covert glance at the idling sedan. I'll sign it. I swear I'll sign it. I don't want the house, I don't want the company, I just don't want to go to federal prison. Please, you can't let her file those toxicology reports. Richard was already sick. I was just trying to follow his instructions. I was confused. I leaned against a brick building, slowly sliding down until I was squatting on the cold sidewalk. It was an incredibly degrading posture, but it was exactly what the private investigator across the street needed to photograph. A broken, pathetic gold digger sobbing in the gutter. Vanessa is a very reasonable woman when she isn't being actively robbed, Sterling replied, his tone dripping with condescension. If you execute the wire cancellation and sign the NDA, she will suppress the medical investigation, but you have to follow her exact instructions. I will, I cried, letting out a ragged, desperate breath. But I need a guarantee. I need to know she won't take the signed papers and press charges anyway. I need witnesses. Witnesses? Sterling scoffed. You are in no position to make demands, Elena. It's not a demand. It's a plea, I whined, pouring on the desperation. I'll do the network cancellation at the memorial service tomorrow, just like she asked, but I want the entire board of directors in the room when I sign the waiver. I want them to see me surrender the assets. I'll apologize to Connor and Vanessa in front of everyone. I just need powerful people in the room to guarantee my physical and legal safety once I hand over the $50 million. If they see me cooperating, Vanessa won't be able to secretly have me arrested afterward. Please, Sterling. Let me humiliate myself in front of the board, and I'll give you everything. I held my breath, waiting for him to take the bait. I knew exactly how narcissistic personalities operated. Vanessa didn't just want to secure her stolen fortune. She wanted a crushing, absolute victory. She wanted to see me grovel in front of the very corporate titans who had judged our marriage. The idea of me sobbing and confessing my defeat to the entire logistics board of directors would be an irresistible feast for her ego. Hold the line, Sterling ordered. I remained squatting on the sidewalk, listening to the muffled hold music. The wind whipped my hair across my face. I kept my expression twisted in artificial agony for the benefit of the observing investigator. 2 minutes passed, then 3. I knew Sterling was consulting with Vanessa. I could picture her in her tailored emerald dress, eyes gleaming with triumph as she envisioned my public surrender. Sterling clicked back onto the line. Vanessa accepts your terms. The board of directors will be assembled in the private VIP suite at the Fairmont immediately following the public memorial service. You will arrive exactly at 6 p.m. You will bring your laptop. You will log into the encrypted family server. You will cancel the pending wire transfer. And you will sign the inheritance waiver in front of the board. If you deviate from this plan by a single syllable, the police will be waiting in the lobby with handcuffs. Do we understand each other? Yes, I moaned, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Tell her I'm sorry. Just be on time, Elena? Sterling hung up. I lowered the phone from my ear. I remained squatting on the sidewalk for another 30 seconds, keeping my head buried in my hands. I let my shoulders heave as if I were crying uncontrollably. Then, I stood up, brushed the dirt off my knees, adjusted my coat, and looked directly at the dark sedan across the street. The tears were completely gone. My heart beat with calm, icy precision. The frantic, terrified widow vanished, entirely replaced by the forensic auditor, who was about to dismantle an empire. Vanessa had agreed to put the entire board of directors in one room. She thought she was setting the stage for my ultimate public humiliation. She had no idea she had just provided me with the perfect audience for her own execution. I needed them all there. I needed the executives, the shareholders, and the corporate lawyers to witness the digital blood trail I was about to expose. If I only confronted Vanessa and Connor in private, they could manipulate the narrative or use their immense wealth to bury the evidence. But with the board watching the raw financial data unspool in real time, there would be no escape. I hailed another cab and directed the driver back to the dingy motel. The ride was silent. I stared out the window at the passing San Francisco skyline, thinking of Richard. He had spent his life building a legacy of integrity, only to be poisoned by the very people who stood to inherit it. They had mocked his intelligence and underestimated his final act of defiance. They had also critically underestimated his wife. I returned to my freezing motel room and threw the deadbolt. I pulled the NDA out of my bag and tossed it onto the bed. It was a worthless piece of paper, a monument to Vanessa's hubris. I had exactly 24 hours until the memorial service. I needed to finalize the evidence packet and prepare the ultimate delivery method. I opened my encrypted laptop. The screen flared to life, displaying the pending $50 million wire transfer. The clock was ticking. It was time to make a very important phone call to the federal government. I pulled a second, burner phone from the hidden lining of my leather tote. During my years dissecting financial crimes in Manhattan, I learned never to trust a single device when dealing with sophisticated corporate predators. I powered it on and connected to the unstable motel Wi-Fi through a triple-layer VPN. I opened a secure messaging app utilizing end-to-end encryption and typed a specific numerical sequence. The sequence was an old emergency beacon. It belonged to Special Agent David Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Miller and I had history. 5 years ago, before I retired to marry Richard, I was the lead forensic auditor on a task force that dismantled a massive tri-state money laundering syndicate. Miller was the primary federal agent on that case. He knew my methods. He knew I never exaggerated a financial discrepancy. And he knew I never called unless I had absolute, irrefutable proof of a felony. I watched the screen as the encrypted line established a connection. The phone rang once before a sharp voice answered. Miller speaking. David, it's Elena. There was a heavy pause on the line. The ambient noise of a busy federal office echoed in the background before a door clicked shut, leaving only silence. Elena, I thought you retired to play house in San Francisco. What's going on? Your voice sounds incredibly tight. Richard is dead, I stated flatly. He passed away just hours ago. Jesus, Elena. I'm so sorry. Was it another stroke? That's what his son and daughter-in-law want the medical examiner to believe, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. But it wasn't a stroke. It was a targeted cardiovascular assassination, orchestrated to cover up a $50 million corporate embezzlement scheme. I heard the squeak of a leather office chair as Miller sat up straight. Do you realize what you're saying right now? That is a massive allegation. Who are the suspects? Connor, my stepson, and Vanessa, his wife. She is the CFO of Richard's logistics company. She has been bleeding the corporate accounts dry for 4 years, using a highly sophisticated layering technique. She routed millions through ghost vendors in Delaware. She laundered the cash through a Panamanian holding firm and consolidated it into a master trust in the Cayman Islands. Miller let out a low whistle. A Cayman trust is next to impossible to crack without an international subpoena. Even if you suspect she's stealing, proving she's the ultimate beneficiary could take years. I already cracked it, I stated. I have the digital incorporation documents. Vanessa and Connor are the sole listed beneficiaries. But that's not why I'm calling you, David. Richard found out about the theft. He used his executive override to pull the $50 million back from the offshore accounts. He trapped the money in a hidden domestic fund to use as evidence against them. Vanessa realized she was caught. She hired a concierge doctor to prescribe Richard a lethal dose of an experimental cardiovascular drug. They murdered him to protect their stolen fortune. The silence on the line was deafening. When Miller finally spoke, his voice was purely professional. The camaraderie of old colleagues was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a federal investigator. You have the proof, Elena? Real, actionable data? I cannot authorize a raid on a prominent corporate executive based on a hunch. I am sending you a secure data packet right now, I said, my fingers flying across my laptop keyboard. I hit the execute command, firing the encrypted file across the network directly to Miller's federal server. Open it. I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Give me the passcode. I recited a 1-2-character alphanumeric string. I heard his breath catch as the files populated on his monitor. Look at folder A, I instructed. Those are the corporate expense ledgers overlaid with the Panamanian routing numbers. Notice the microtransactions. Vanessa used an obscure payment gateway to smurf the stolen funds just under the automated compliance flags. Now open folder B. Those are the beneficiary signatures for the Cayman Trust. This is incredible, Miller muttered, his voice thick with absolute disbelief. You mapped the entire laundering network in under an hour. I mapped it while sitting in a freezing motel room after they forged a probate order to evict me from my own home, I clarified. Now open folder C. That's the smoking gun. It links a $2 million consulting fee, authorized by Vanessa, directly to a Belize biomedical firm owned by Dr. Arrington. That is the man who prescribed the fatal medication to Richard 18 days ago. Elena, if this data verifies, we are looking at federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. But we have a major jurisdictional problem. The money is still on the company's network. Unless they take possession of the funds, proving intent to steal the consolidated $50 million will be an exhausting legal battle. Their expensive lawyers will tie us up in federal court for a decade. They are going to take possession of the funds tomorrow evening, I revealed, a cold smile touching my lips. Explain. Richard initiated a wire transfer of the entire $50 million to a blind account right before he died. The transfer is currently on a 8-hour banking hold. Vanessa and Connor are forcing me to log into the corporate server tomorrow night during a private memorial gathering with the board of directors. They want me to cancel the transfer and sign an inheritance waiver. If I don't comply, they have explicitly threatened to frame me for Richard's murder using manipulated toxicology reports. Miller cursed under his breath. They're trying to force you to hand the evidence back to them. If you cancel that transfer, Vanessa will instantly reroute the money back to the Cayman Islands and scrub the internal ledgers. The money will disappear permanently. I am not going to cancel the transfer, David. I'm going to redirect it. I pulled up the custom routing script I had been coding all night. I've built a bypass command. When they force me to access the server in front of the board of directors, I am going to execute a forced diversion. I need you to provide me with the exact routing and account numbers for the DOJ Asset Forfeiture Depository. I'm going to push the $50 million directly into federal custody. A harsh laugh broke from Miller. You're going to wire $50 million of stolen corporate funds into a federal evidence vault in front of the entire board of directors? Yes. And I need you and your strike team waiting in the lobby of the Fairmont Hotel tomorrow at exactly 6 p.m. When that money hits your depository account, I want you to breach the room and arrest Vanessa and Connor for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. I'll verify the data packets immediately, Miller said, the thrill of the hunt evident in his voice. If these routing data points hold up, I will have the warrant signed by a federal judge before noon. I'm bringing a full tactical team. We will be waiting in the wings, Elena. Don't let them see you coming. They think I'm a broken, terrified widow, I said, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen. They think they've already won. We finalized the tactical logistics, coordinating the exact timing of the sting operation. I disconnected the call and destroyed the burner phone, cracking the plastic casing under the heel of my boot. I turned back to my laptop, punching the federal routing numbers Miller had provided into my bypass script. The code was flawless. The digital trap was completely armed and ready for execution. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair, watching the sunrise over the San Francisco skyline. The morning light painted the gray clouds with streaks of purple and bruised gold. Vanessa wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the corporate elite. I was going to give her a show she would never forget. I looked away from the window and rubbed my tired eyes. I had exactly 12 hours before I had to walk into the Fairmont Hotel. Uncovering the crime wasn't the hard part. The hard part was building a digital trap so flawless that the CFO of a billion-dollar logistics empire wouldn't see it coming until the steel handcuffs were already locked around her wrists. I opened a specialized coding environment on my laptop. Vanessa was going to force me to log into the corporate banking portal. She would stand over my shoulder and watch me click the specific bright red button labeled Cancel Pending Transfer. To her, that click meant victory. It meant the $50 million would return to the internal company ledger, where she could instantly plunge it back into the Cayman Islands Trust. I needed to give her the visual satisfaction of that click. I began writing a localized interface overlay. It was a sophisticated digital mask that would sit perfectly over the genuine banking portal. To anyone looking at the screen, it would appear identical to the standard corporate interface. But I was fundamentally rewiring the back-end command hierarchy. I linked the graphic coordinates of the cancellation button to the bypass script I had written earlier with Agent Miller. When my cursor hit that specific pixel zone, the system would not send a cancellation signal to the bank. Instead, it would act as an irrevocable execution command. It would aggressively authorize the pending transfer and instantly redirect the entire $50 million to the DOJ Evidence Depository account. I typed line after line of alphanumeric code, my fingers finding a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pace. I was building what forensic auditors call a dead man's switch. Once that button was clicked, the sequence could not be aborted. Not by me, not by Vanessa, not by any emergency network override she might attempt to deploy from her own devices. But I had to plan for contingencies. What if Connor realized what I was doing and tried to physically rip the laptop out of my hands? What if Sterling, the probate lawyer, demanded to inspect the machine before I initiated the sequence? I coded a secondary trigger mechanism. I linked the execution command to a specific keystroke combination. If anyone attempted to force the laptop lid shut, or if an incorrect master password was entered, the system would immediately lock the screen. It would wipe the local hard drive to protect my forensic data and silently fire the routing command through the backend server. The money was going to the federal government no matter what happened in that VIP room. I spent the next 4 hours running rigorous diagnostic simulations. I launched a virtual sandbox environment on my desktop, mimicking the exact security parameters of the logistics company's servers. I executed the fake cancellation protocol 30 different times. Every single time, the visual interface functioned flawlessly, mimicking a standard cancellation graphic, while the backend data showed the $50 million landing safely in the simulated federal vault. The code was impenetrable. The digital guillotine was assembled and ready to drop. I checked the time. It was just past 2 p.m. I shut the laptop, placed it carefully into a waterproof sleeve, and shoved it into my leather tote. My technical preparations were entirely complete. Now I needed to prepare physically. I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the motel sink. I looked exactly like the shattered victim Vanessa expected to see. My hair was tangled, my skin was pale, and the silk blouse I wore was still wrinkled and stained with Richard's blood. I couldn't walk into a luxury hotel looking like a desperate vagrant. If I looked too chaotic, hotel security might block my entry before I even reached the memorial gathering. Furthermore, I refused to let Richard's board of directors see me as the pathetic gold digger Vanessa had painted me as. I left the motel, keeping my tote bag clutched tightly against my side. I walked 3 blocks down the commercial avenue until I found a mid-tier department store. I went straight to the women's professional section. I used $40 of my remaining cash to buy a simple, sharp charcoal blazer and a pair of matching slacks. It wasn't anywhere near the tailored designer clothing I was accustomed to wearing in Pacific Heights, but the dark, clean lines gave me a shield of professional armor. I used my remaining dollars to buy a cheap coffee, asking the barista for a cup of ice water on the side. I took the clothes and the water into the store's restroom. I peeled off the ruined silk blouse, tossing it directly into the trash can. I used the ice water and paper towels to scrub the exhaustion and grime off my face. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun at the nape of my neck, mimicking the rigid, aggressive style Vanessa favored. I pulled on the black slacks and buttoned the sharp charcoal blazer. I looked at myself in the mirror. The grieving, terrified widow was completely gone. The woman staring back at me was cold, calculating, and ready for war. I stepped back out onto the street. The heavy San Francisco rain had settled into a persistent, freezing drizzle. The gray afternoon sky mirrored the bleak reality of the day. Richard was dead, murdered by the people he had raised and trusted. My heart ached with a deep, hollow sorrow, but I forced the grief down into a locked box at the back of my mind. I would mourn my husband tomorrow. Today, I had to be his executioner. I walked another 2 blocks to a busy transit station and boarded a public bus heading toward the downtown financial district. The ride was a slow, agonizing crawl through rush-hour traffic. I kept my hand firmly resting on my leather tote, feeling the solid weight of the laptop pressing against my leg. At exactly 5:45 p.m., the bus pulled to a stop 2 blocks from the Fairmont Hotel. I stepped down onto the wet pavement, adjusting my blazer against the biting wind. The towering facade of the hotel loomed ahead, glowing with warm golden light against the darkening city skyline. I walked toward the grand entrance, my posture impeccably straight. My heels tapped a steady, rhythmic cadence against the concrete. I approached the heavy brass doors of the hotel lobby. I was walking directly into the lion's den, completely unarmed except for a laptop and a brilliant piece of code. I took one final, deep breath and pushed the doors open. The sudden warmth of the Fairmont's lobby enveloped me, a sharp contrast to the freezing San Francisco rain. The air smelled of expensive lilies, polished mahogany, and old money. The concierge staff murmured in low, respectful tones, expertly directing a steady stream of the city's corporate elite toward the grand ballroom on the second floor. I blended into the periphery of the crowd, keeping my head perfectly high and my leather tote bag pressed firmly against my ribs. As I ascended the sweeping marble staircase, the low hum of somber networking grew progressively louder. This wasn't a genuine memorial service for a beloved father and husband. I knew these people. I knew this world. This was a high-stakes corporate power transition, expertly draped in black velvet and fake tears. I pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The space was breathtakingly opulent, designed specifically to project wealth and stability. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests. Tasteful, extravagant floral arrangements flanked a massive portrait of Richard standing center stage. In the photograph, he looked handsome, commanding, and fiercely alive. A sudden, violent pang of genuine grief struck my chest, threatening to shatter my carefully constructed armor. I dug my fingernails into my palms, ruthlessly locking the pain away. I couldn't afford to be a widow right now. I had to be a forensic auditor walking into a crime scene. I scanned the sprawling room. It didn't take long to spot my targets. Connor and Vanessa were perfectly positioned near the front of the ballroom, acting as corporate royalty. They were putting on an absolute masterclass in manipulation and PR. Connor wore a tailored black morning suit, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey. He was currently speaking with the company's chief operating officer, his head bowed respectfully, his free hand resting over his heart in a flawless display of stoic, masculine heartbreak. Vanessa stood beside him, exuding quiet power. She wore a somber but stunningly fitted black designer dress that commanded respect. She lightly rubbed Connor's back as he spoke, projecting the pristine image of a devoted, fiercely protective wife. But I watched her eyes. They were sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of sorrow. She was rapidly scanning the room, evaluating board members, locking in their loyalty. She was silently assuring anxious shareholders that the logistics empire's financial future was completely secure in her highly capable hands. Then, someone near the entrance noticed me. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable and immediate. The polite, low hum of corporate chatter dropped a full octave, replaced by a tense electric silence. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, whispers erupted like small wildfires across the ballroom. Connor's social media broadcast from that morning had clearly reached every single person in this room. They had all seen his tearful, fabricated video, accusing me of trying to steal $50 million from a dying man. A physical path literally opened up in front of me as I moved through the ballroom. Wealthy executive wives pulled their husbands away by the arm as I approached, treating me like a walking contagion. People I had graciously hosted for dinner at the Pacific Heights estate just weeks prior actively turned their backs on me, completely refusing to make eye contact. I was a pariah. In their eyes, I was the manipulative, gold-digging murderer who had been caught red-handed trying to loot Richard's estate. I spotted an older man standing near the catering tables. He was a board member who had always praised my business acumen during company galas. I gave him a small, polite nod, seeking just one familiar face of basic human decency. The executive stared at me with absolute, undisguised revulsion. He purposefully turned his back on me and walked directly over to join Connor's inner circle. The message was loud and undeniably clear. The board had already chosen its side. I was completely excommunicated. Connor noticed the sudden commotion rippling through the crowd. He looked through the sea of expensive black suits and locked eyes with me. His gaze was completely devoid of grief, replaced by a sick, arrogant triumph. He gave me a microscopic smirk, raising his whiskey glass a fraction of an inch in a silent, sarcastic toast. He was gloating. He was reveling in my absolute public destruction. Vanessa didn't even bother to look at me. She simply checked her diamond-encrusted watch, subtly signaling that our scheduled deadline was rapidly approaching. They were deliberately letting the crowd isolate and humiliate me, softening me up for the final kill. They wanted me feeling small, hated, and completely desperate to comply with their demands. They wanted me to walk into that private VIP room completely broken, eager to sign away my rights just to escape the crushing weight of public judgment. The isolation was supposed to crush me. Vanessa had engineered this exact scenario, making sure every board member, every shareholder, and every family friend saw me as a toxic outcast before the critical meeting even began. She wanted me stripped of allies. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of the establishment lined up against me, so that when the time came to sign the NDA, I would fold without a single word of protest. I walked to the back of the ballroom, finding a quiet, shadowed corner near the hallway leading to the executive suites. I stood alone, gripping the strap of my leather tote, feeling the solid weight of the laptop resting securely against my hip. Let them stare. Let them whisper their vicious, fabricated rumors. Their contempt meant absolutely nothing to me. In less than 20 minutes, the entire hierarchy of this room was going to burn to the ground. At exactly 6 p.m., a burly security guard in a dark suit approached my shadowed corner. He gestured sharply toward the discreet hallway, located just behind the main stage. It was time. I tightened my grip on the leather tote and followed him, stepping away from the glaring lights of the ballroom. The heavy ambient noise of the crowd vanished instantly as the guard pushed open a thick mahogany door, ushering me into the VIP executive boardroom. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocatingly tense, heavy with the silent judgment of the corporate elite who had gathered to witness my execution. A massive, polished oak conference table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and open hostility. At the head of the table sat Chairman Vance, a man who had feasted at my dining table for years but who now refused to even acknowledge my presence. Flanking him were 5 other senior members of the Logistics Empire's board. Their faces were set in identical masks of stone-cold judgment. Sterling, the probate shark, sat next to the chairman. He was meticulously organizing a terrifyingly thick stack of legal documents. Connor and Vanessa were standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-soaked city. Vanessa looked absolutely radiant in her victory. She uncrossed her arms and walked slowly to the head of the table, pulling out a chair with a deliberate, authoritative scrape against the hardwood floor. "Take a seat, Elena," Vanessa instructed, pointing to a solitary chair placed at the absolute far end of the long table. It was an interrogation setup, designed perfectly to make me feel small, isolated, and completely overwhelmed by the corporate machinery arrayed against me. I stepped forward, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and took the seat. I kept my head slightly bowed, maintaining the illusion of a broken, defeated woman. I placed my leather tote on the floor next to my ankle and rested my hands in my lap. I made them tremble just a fraction. "Let us dispense with the formalities," Chairman Vance began, his voice gravelly and devoid of warmth. "The board has been fully briefed on the situation by our CFO. We are aware of your unauthorized attempt to wire $50 million of corporate capital to a hidden offshore account while our founder drew his final breaths. The sheer audacity of your actions has put this entire company at risk." I looked up, letting a look of manufactured panic wash over my face. "I was just following his instructions," I pleaded, my voice cracking perfectly. "Richard told me to move it. He said he needed to protect the funds." Connor let out a harsh, echoing laugh that bounced off the mahogany-paneled walls. "Protect the funds from who, Elena? From the people who actually run his company? You manipulated a dying man whose brain was literally bleeding out. You are lucky we are allowing you to walk out of this hotel instead of having you escorted out in handcuffs by local law enforcement." Sterling tapped his expensive fountain pen against the stack of papers. "The narrative is irrelevant at this juncture. What matters is the strict execution of this settlement." He pushed the massive stack of papers across the polished wood. They came to a stop right in front of me. The blank signature line stared back at me. "Mrs. Elena, I have prepared the final non-disclosure agreements and the complete waiver of your inheritance rights. By signing these documents, you legally forfeit any and all claims to the estate, the Pacific Heights property, and any liquid assets connected to the logistics firm. In exchange, the board agrees to drop the criminal fraud charges and release a $1 million cashier's check to you immediately." Vanessa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her dark eyes bored into me, stripping away any remaining pretense of civility. "The paperwork is secondary, Elena. The priority is the wire transfer. You will open your laptop right now. You will log into the secure corporate portal using the localized network we have provided. You will cancel the pending $50 million transaction, returning the funds directly to the master corporate ledger where they belong. Only after that money is confirmed secure will you receive your settlement check." I looked at the board members. Not a single one of them flinched at Vanessa dictating terms like a mafia boss. They were so blinded by their greed and their desire to protect the company's stock price that they blindly trusted their CFO. They had absolutely no idea they were aiding and abetting a murderer. "What if I just walk away?" I whimpered, shrinking back into my chair. What if I leave the money alone and let the probate court sort it out? Vanessa stood up, placing her hands flat on the oak table. If you walk out that door without canceling the transfer, I will authorize Sterling to file the amended toxicology reports. I will personally hand the police the forged statements from the household staff claiming you abused Richard. You won't make it past the hotel lobby before you are arrested for murder. You have no leverage, Elena. Open the laptop. I let a single, heavy tear spill over my lashes and roll down my cheek. I sniffled, reaching down to unzip my leather tote. I slowly pulled out the encrypted laptop, placing it gently on the table. Sterling pulled a secondary monitor from a briefcase and plugged a visual mirroring cable into the side of my machine. The board requires visual confirmation of the cancellation, he explained coldly. We will watch you execute the command on this screen. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on my keyboard. I hit the power button. The screen flared to life. I typed in my complex alphanumeric passcode, unlocking the main drive. My hands were visibly shaking now, but this time it wasn't an act. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins like battery acid. We were seconds away from execution. I opened the secure banking application. The interface loaded, projecting my screen perfectly onto the large monitor facing Sterling and the board of directors. The room collectively held its breath as the financial dashboard appeared in crisp, high-resolution detail. There it was. $50,340,000. The status indicator flashed a bright yellow warning. Approval pending. Right there, Connor ordered, pointing a stiff finger at the monitor. Click the red button. Cancel it right now. I moved my hand over the trackpad. The cursor glided across the screen, hovering directly over the bright red cancellation command. This was the exact pixel zone I had rewired during my grueling hours in the motel room. To everyone in the room, it looked like a standard banking interface. They were entirely unaware that my hidden bypass script was coiled beneath that button, ready to strike like a viper. Vanessa watched my finger hover over the trackpad. Her chest was heaving with anxious anticipation. Do it, Elena. Give us our money back. I paused. I lifted my head and looked away from the glowing screen. I looked directly into Vanessa's arrogant, calculating eyes. Then I looked at Connor, who was practically vibrating with greed. I completely dropped the pathetic, broken widow facade. My posture snapped straight. The manufactured fear vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of pure forensic fury. It was never your money, Vanessa, I said, my voice ringing with a crystalline authority that shattered the silent tension of the room. It was always his. And he knew exactly how you stole every last dime. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The kind of deep, heavy silence that usually precedes a catastrophic explosion. Vanessa's perfect mask cracked. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic breaking her calculated exterior before she rapidly suppressed it. She let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, looking toward Chairman Vance and the rest of the board. She's having a psychotic break, Vanessa announced, her voice modulated to convey fake sympathy mixed with exasperation. The grief has completely unhinged her. Sterling, call hotel security. We need her escorted out before she hurts herself. Sterling reached into his pocket for his phone, but I slammed my flat hand against the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Put the phone down, Sterling, I commanded. My voice held no hysterical notes. It was cold, precise, and carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. If security walks through those doors, the financial data I am about to project on this screen goes directly to the Wall Street Journal instead of staying confined to this room. Sterling froze, his hand hovering over his pocket. Chairman Vance frowned, his thick white eyebrows knitting together as he looked from Vanessa to me. What are you talking about, Elena? Vance demanded. His tone was cautious, but the executive in him was listening. Corporate survival instinct always trumps loyalty. I pushed the non-disclosure agreement and the $1 million check away. I slid them across the polished wood until they fell off the edge and fluttered uselessly to the floor. I stood up slowly. Allow me to properly introduce myself, Chairman Vance, I said, staring down the most powerful man in the room. You all know me as Richard's young wife, the former interior decorator, the gold digger who spent her days planning garden parties. That is the narrative Vanessa so carefully crafted for you. I took a step to the side, distancing myself from the solitary chair they had placed me in. But before I met your founder, I was a lead forensic auditor at a top-tier financial crimes firm in Manhattan. I spent a decade dismantling international money laundering syndicates and corporate embezzlement rings. I tracked phantom funds for a living. I see the financial architecture that external auditors overlook. Connor's face flushed a deep, violent red. "Shut up," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "Shut your mouth right now, you lying fraud." "Sit down, Connor," Chairman Vance barked. The older man leaned forward, his gaze locked on my face. "Let her speak." Vanessa's hands were gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone completely white. "Chairman, you cannot entertain this delusion. She is trying to distract us from the fact that she initiated a $50 million wire transfer while Richard was in a coma. I initiated the transfer because Richard gave me the access codes 36 hours ago while he was fully conscious." I fired back, my voice cutting through Vanessa's desperate defense. "He begged me to move the funds because he had finally gathered the ultimate proof of your massive corporate treason." I turned my attention entirely to the board of directors. I had their undivided attention. "Over the last 4 years, this company has experienced a surge in operational costs," I stated, shifting into full presentation mode. "You were told it was due to international shipping tariffs and unavoidable supply chain disruptions. Vanessa presented you with beautifully formatted quarterly reports to justify the shrinking profit margins. But the margins weren't shrinking naturally. They were being bled." I watched the color drain from Vanessa's face. She knew exactly what was coming. "Your CFO utilized a secondary payment gateway," I continued, pointing a steady finger directly at Vanessa. "She shredded massive freight contracts into thousands of microtransactions. This is a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing, designed specifically to bypass your automated compliance flags. Those microtransactions were routed to a shipping entity registered in Delaware, a company that possesses no physical address, no active fleet, no payroll records. A ghost vendor." "That is a lie!" Vanessa hissed. But her voice lacked its usual authoritative resonance. It sounded thin, desperate. I ignored her completely, pressing the attack. "From Delaware, your corporation's funds were laundered through a holding firm in Panama to break the chain of custody. Then, they were consolidated into a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust account holding exactly $50 million. Chairman Vance slowly turned to look at Vanessa. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging deeply alarmed glances. The level of detail I was providing was far too specific to be the ravings of a grieving, delusional widow. "Richard found the discrepancy during his stroke recovery last year," I explained, keeping the narrative flowing with relentless momentum. He had time to review the raw, unfiltered data away from Vanessa's curated presentations. He realized his own son and daughter-in-law were tearing his life's work apart. So he used his executive override authority to quietly claw back the stolen funds from the Cayman Trust. He trapped the blood money in a hidden domestic account, the Alpha Fund, gathering it as the definitive physical evidence of your massive wire fraud. Connor looked like he was going to physically implode. His hands were opening and closing into tight fists. "She's insane. She hacked the network. She created these fake numbers to cover her own tracks." "I did?" I challenged, my eyes locking onto him. "Then explain how I possess the digital incorporation documents for the Cayman Trust. Explain how your digital signature and Vanessa's digital signature are listed as the sole beneficiaries of the stolen $50 million. A collective gasp ripped through the board members. Sterling, the probate lawyer, suddenly took 2 very deliberate steps away from Connor and Vanessa, physically distancing himself from his own clients. His legal survival instincts had just kicked in. Vanessa lunged across the table. Her polished demeanor evaporated completely, replaced by raw, frantic terror. She reached for the laptop resting in front of me, desperate to slam the lid shut and kill the connection to the monitor. "Don't touch that machine, Vanessa," I warned, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from the keyboard. "I know how you operate," I said, staring her down. "I built a secondary trigger mechanism into this terminal. If you attempt to close that lid, or if anyone enters an incorrect master password, the system will immediately lock the screen. It will instantly wipe the local hard drive to protect my forensic data, and it will silently send the back-end routing command directly through the server. You make one sudden move, and you lose all control of this situation." Vanessa slowly pulled her hand back. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, as she glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She finally realized the depth of her miscalculation. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, completely unaware that I held the nuclear launch codes. "You have the board's attention, Elena," Chairman Vance said. His voice was grim, devoid of any prior skepticism. "You've made severe accusations. Now show us the proof." I placed my hand back on the laptop trackpad. The time for talking was over. It was time to show them the bodies buried under the floorboards. I tapped a very specific sequence of keys and expertly executed the primary display command. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted at the head of the mahogany table flickered. The fake banking interface disappeared entirely, replaced by a stark, high-contrast digital map. It was a sprawling, interconnected web of data points that glowed with raw financial truth. I stood up and moved toward the screen, abandoning my position at the far end of the table. I commanded the room now. "Let us begin with the third quarter of last year," I stated, highlighting a cluster of red data nodes on the left side of the screen. Our international freight division secured a massive logistics contract with European distributors. According to the internal books presented by your CFO, the operational costs for that specific quarter spiked by 12%. Vanessa blamed unexpected port tariffs and fuel price surges. But if we pull the actual vendor invoices, the truth emerges. I clicked my wireless mouse. A series of scanned documents populated the monitor. You will notice thousands of micro-invoices issued to an entity named Apex Freight. These invoices average just under $10,000 each. By keeping the individual amounts low, Vanessa ensured they bypassed the automated secondary review protocols required for large vendor payouts. She authorized every single one of these payouts using her executive administrative credentials. I highlighted a specific string of code at the bottom of the invoices. That is her digital authorization signature. Undeniable and time-stamped. Chairman Vance leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the screen. Where did this money actually go? I clicked the mouse again. The red nodes on the map animated, drawing a glowing line directly from the corporate accounts to a single destination. "It went to Delaware," I explained. "Apex Freight is a shell company. It has no trucks, no warehouses, no employees. It is a paper phantom." But the money didn't stay there. Vanessa utilized a classic layering technique to hide the trail. Another click. The map shifted, showing the funds bouncing from Delaware to a corporate registry in Panama, then splitting into a dozen different private accounts in Switzerland. She fractured the capital to confuse any potential external audit. I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. But money leaves a gravitational pull. If you follow the mass, it always consolidates. I executed the final mapping command. The scattered data points on the screen converged, forming a single, massive golden node located in the Caribbean. The money pooled into a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands, I announced. A fortress designed to hide illicit wealth from federal regulators. Finding the trust is difficult, but proving ownership is usually impossible because they use proxy directors. Fortunately for us, I don't rely on public records. I rely on encrypted back-end data. I pulled up the deeply buried incorporation documents I had extracted from the offshore servers. The text was dense with legal jargon, but the crucial information was highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow. Look at the beneficiary listings, I instructed the board. The entire room erupted into immediate gasps of shock from every seated executive. There, displayed in massive font for the entire corporate hierarchy to see, were the digital signatures and verified identities of the sole beneficiaries of the $50 million Cayman Trust, Connor and Vanessa. "You miserable thief!" a senior board member shouted, slamming his fist on the table as he glared at Vanessa. "We trusted you with the entire financial foundation of this company. It's fabricated!" Vanessa shrieked. Her pristine composure was completely shattered. Her voice was shrill, desperate. She hacked the network and planted those documents to frame us. She is a forensic accountant. She knows exactly how to manipulate digital evidence. Connor backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors, as if calculating his chances of escaping the hotel. "If I fabricated this data," I shot back, my voice easily cutting through her panic, "then how do you explain the next folder?" I didn't give them a second to breathe. I clicked the mouse, opening the most damning piece of evidence I possessed. The screen shifted from offshore banking records to corporate executive health plan disbursements. "Stealing $50 million requires constant maintenance," I explained, pacing slowly behind the row of seated executives. Richard was brilliant. He noticed the microscopic bleeding in the margins. 3 weeks ago, he initiated a secret internal audit. He found the embezzlement. He used his founder-level executive override to hijack the Panamanian routing chain, clawing the stolen $50 million back into a hidden domestic account, the Alpha Fund. He was gathering the ultimate proof to hand you over to the authorities. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle into the silent room. And you realized he caught you, Vanessa. You knew you were about to lose your wealth, your career, and your freedom, so you decided to silence him. I displayed a new document on the screen. It was a payment authorization log. 18 days ago, Vanessa forced Richard to switch his primary care to a highly exclusive concierge doctor named Dr. Arrington. She paid his exorbitant fee using the corporate executive health plan. But if we dig into the secondary ledgers, an entirely different story is revealed. I clicked the mouse. A hidden transaction appeared, linking Vanessa to a biomedical research firm registered in Belize. Vanessa authorized a separate, heavily concealed $2 million consulting fee to this Belize entity. The principal shareholder of that firm is a holding company controlled directly by Dr. Arrington. Chairman Vance stood up, his face pale with horror. Are you saying she paid a doctor $2 million to commit murder? To literally assassinate my husband, I finished, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Dr. Arrington discontinued Richard's standard blood thinners and prescribed him an experimental cardiovascular drug, a drug explicitly known to cause fatal cardiac arrest in patients with a history of arterial damage. He prescribed a lethal dose under the guise of stroke prevention. Vanessa paid a hitman to trigger a fatal heart attack before Richard could expose her fraud. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Executives were shouting over one another, their voices thick with outrage and disbelief. Sterling, the probate lawyer, was frantically shoving his legal documents back into his briefcase, desperate to flee the room and sever all ties with his clients. Connor grabbed Vanessa tightly by the arm, his face completely twisted in pure terror. "We have to get out of this hotel right now," he stammered. Vanessa ripped herself out of his grip. She lunged forward, her eyes wild with feral, cornered desperation. She stared at the laptop resting on the table, realizing the only way to save herself was to destroy the machine broadcasting her crimes. "Shut it all down!" Vanessa screamed, throwing her body across the polished oak table toward my computer. The absolute final act of the dark play had arrived. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I stood perfectly still and prepared to deliver the killing blow. Connor snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward, sweeping a crystal water pitcher off the table as he scrambled for the keyboard. He wanted to smash the glass and sever the connection to the monitor displaying their ruin. I moved faster. My hand like that was like the Satter Onnen. My hand darted out, my index finger finding the enter key. I pressed it with every ounce of force I possessed. A sharp, authoritative chime echoed from the laptop's speakers. Connor crashed into the edge of the table, his grasping hands missing the computer by inches. Vanessa slumped against the polished wood, staring wildly at the massive screen. She expected the terminal to go completely black, expecting a cancellation confirmation. Instead, the interface completely transformed. The fake banking overlay dissolved into green pixels. The true back-end routing script flooded the monitor. A progress bar appeared, glowing with intense finality. "Transaction authorized," the computerized voice announced, the automated audio filling the deathly silence of the VIP suite. Vanessa recoiled, her eyes wide with frantic confusion. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. "You wired it to yourself. You stole it! Sterling, call the police right now." She just stole $50 million. Sterling didn't move a single muscle. The probate lawyer was pressed against the far wall, his hands slightly raised in the air, trying to become completely invisible to avoid any legal association with the unfolding disaster. "Look at the routing destination, Vanessa," I commanded, stepping away from the table and crossing my arms tightly over my black blazer. "Look exactly where your stolen fortune just went." Chairman Vance and the rest of the board members craned their necks to read the massive text scrolling across the monitor. The progress bar hit 100%, a bold green confirmation box locked into the center of the screen for everyone to see. Funds transferred. Amount: $50,340,000. Destination: United States Department of Justice. Division: Corporate Fraud Task Force. Account type: Active Custody Evidence Vault. Vanessa stopped breathing. Her perfectly structured world shattered into a million irreparable pieces in real time. Connor stumbled backward, his face completely drained of color. He looked from the screen to his wife, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. "No," he gasped, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. "No, don't send it." "It's already gone, Connor," I stated, my voice echoing with icy triumph. "I didn't steal a single penny. I surrendered it. I took the entire $50 million you murdered Richard to protect, and I handed it directly to the federal government as the primary physical evidence in a massive corporate homicide investigation." "You crazy, vindictive gold digger!" Vanessa screamed. She lunged at me, her hands curling into vicious claws, desperate to inflict physical pain now that her financial empire was completely eradicated. Before she could even cross the plush carpet, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite burst open. The violent impact shook the entire room. A highly coordinated team of federal agents flooded the space. They moved with terrifying tactical precision, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow FBI lettering across the back. The sheer physical presence of the strike team instantly neutralized any remaining threat in the room. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" a booming voice commanded, stopping Vanessa dead in her tracks. Special Agent David Miller walked through the door, his gold badge held high. His sharp eyes scanned the chaotic scene, rapidly assessing the frozen board members, the terrified lawyer, and the two primary targets standing near the conference table. He looked at me and gave a microscopic, deeply respectful nod. The trap had worked flawlessly. "Vanessa Sterling and Connor Sterling," Agent Miller announced, his voice carrying the crushing, absolute weight of federal authority. He pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his pocket. "You are both under arrest." "For what?" Connor shrieked, his voice cracking violently as two heavily armed agents grabbed his arms and roughly forced them behind his back. "We didn't do anything wrong. This is a private corporate meeting. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder," Agent Miller stated, reading directly from the official warrant. "We have secured the $50 million in the DOJ depository account. We also have federal units currently raiding Dr. Arrington's offices. We have the medical logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital authorizations. It is completely over." Vanessa fought savagely against the agents attempting to restrain her. She kicked and thrashed, her emerald designer dress twisting as the cold steel handcuffs clicked brutally around her wrists, locking her arms behind her back. "This is a setup!" she screamed, spitting venom in my direction. "She engineered this entire situation. She's framing us. You have to listen to me." "Save it for the federal judge, Vanessa," Agent Miller replied coldly. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you start using it immediately." The board of directors watched in absolute stunned silence as the two arrogant, ruthless heirs to the logistics empire were reduced to screaming, desperate criminals. The polished veneer of corporate invincibility was completely gone. Connor began sobbing loudly, his genuine tears now born of absolute terror, as the federal agents forcefully dragged him toward the exit. Vanessa refused to break eye contact with me as they hauled her backward toward the door. Her eyes burned with unadulterated hatred. "You will pay for this, Elena," she hissed, her voice echoing down the hallway as she fought the agents. "I will destroy you." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hands steady. I looked at the woman who had murdered my husband, and I smiled. A cold, victorious smile. "You already tried, Vanessa," I said softly. "And you failed." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, cutting off Vanessa's screams. The finality of that sound echoed in the VIP suite like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The chaotic energy vanished, leaving a sterile, ringing silence. Through the walls, I could hear the muffled scuff of expensive leather shoes sliding against the hallway marble, followed by the metallic clink of handcuffs tightening. Connor was loudly begging for his father, a pathetic display from a man who had orchestrated the execution of that very father. Inside the boardroom, nobody moved. The logistics executives were completely frozen in their high-backed chairs. They stared at the empty doorway, then slowly turned their collective gaze toward me. I remained standing at the head of the oak conference table, my posture rigid, my black blazer pristine. I was no longer the vulnerable, discarded widow they had mocked in the ballroom just 30 minutes prior. I was the absolute epicenter of their survival. A sudden, frantic shuffling noise broke the tension. Sterling, the ruthless probate shark who had gleefully presented my eviction notice hours after my husband's death, was attempting a desperate tactical retreat. His hands were shaking violently as he stuffed his forged legal documents into his designer briefcase. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, hoping to slip out the side exit before the federal agents returned. "Going somewhere, Sterling?" I asked. My voice was low, but it commanded the room effortlessly. Sterling froze. He slowly straightened his posture, attempting to summon his arrogant courtroom persona. "I am asserting attorney-client privilege," he stammered. "My clients have been detained. I must go to federal court to arrange their bail hearings." "You aren't going to a bail hearing, Sterling," Agent Miller announced, stepping back into the VIP suite. The federal investigator locked eyes with the trembling lawyer. "You are going to need your own legal representation." "I am a licensed attorney. I simply drafted an emergency court order based on financial data provided by the CFO. I had no knowledge of any corporate embezzlement or medical foul play." "Ignorance is a terrible defense when your signature is on the perjury," I shot back, stepping closer to him. "You woke up a Superior Court judge at 2 a.m. You filed a sworn affidavit claiming I posed an immediate flight risk. You drafted a legal fiction to illegally evict a lawful spouse from her marital home, bypassing standard probate notice periods." "I was operating under sworn testimony from the household staff," Sterling argued weakly. "Testimony that Vanessa paid for using corporate accounts," Agent Miller interrupted. "We cross-referenced the bank records Elena provided. Vanessa wired $50,000 to the estate manager just 2 days before Richard's death. It was a direct bribe to secure fake witness statements. As an executing attorney, you failed to perform a basic fiduciary review. My legal duty was to the primary beneficiary of the trust. Your legal duty was to the law," I snapped. "You knowingly filed a fraudulent affidavit to secure a wrongful eviction. You facilitated the freezing of my personal bank accounts to financially cripple a witness to a federal crime. That is criminal conspiracy." Agent Miller gestured to a pair of tactical agents waiting in the hallway. "Robert Sterling, you are being detained for questioning regarding the filing of fraudulent legal documents. You are also a person of interest in a federal wire fraud conspiracy." "No, you can't do this," Sterling protested, panic overriding his polished exterior. "I'm a partner at my firm. I didn't know about the murder." "I swear." The agents flanked him immediately, grabbing his wrists with practiced efficiency. Sterling dropped his designer briefcase. The brass clasp popped open as it hit the carpet, spilling the fraudulent NDAs and the $1 million hush money check across the floor. The sound of a third set of steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed in the VIP suite. "You are going to lose your law license by tomorrow morning, Sterling," I stated coldly as the agents marched him toward the door. "And you are going to spend the next decade trying to plea bargain your way out of a federal conspiracy charge." As Sterling was hauled away, I turned my attention back to the conference table. The board of directors looked absolutely terrified. The power dynamic of the logistics empire had been violently reset in under 10 minutes. Chairman Vance slowly stood up, smoothing his tie. He looked at the projected screen still displaying the DOJ deposit confirmation, and then looked directly at me. "Elena," he began diplomatically. The board had no idea the extent of Vanessa's deception. "We thought we were protecting the company and Richard's legacy. We sincerely apologize for any distress we have caused you tonight. We are fully prepared to reinstate your access to the estate and assist you in claiming your rightful inheritance." I stared at the chairman. This was the exact same man who had purposefully turned his back on me in the ballroom 30 minutes ago. He allowed Vanessa to treat me like a criminal. His sudden apology was motivated entirely by the terrifying realization that I held the digital evidence that could easily implicate the entire executive board in massive corporate negligence. They had failed in their fiduciary duties, allowing $50 million to bleed out right under their noses. "Your apologies mean absolutely nothing to me, Chairman," I replied, my voice slicing through his pathetic attempt at diplomacy. "You didn't protect Richard's legacy, you protected your stock options. You blindly trusted a murderer because she kept your quarterly dividends high, and you threw me to the wolves because I was the most convenient solution to your PR problem." Vance swallowed hard, flushing with unmistakable shame. The other executives kept their eyes glued to the polished oak table. Agent Miller stood beside me. "The Department of Justice will be conducting a full, uncensored audit of this entire corporation starting tomorrow morning, Miller announced to the room. Every financial decision made by this board over the last 4 years will be scrutinized by federal investigators. Nobody leaves town. The executive suite felt like a tomb. The elite corporate titans were completely trapped, stripped of their power, and facing the absolute destruction of their professional lives. I reached down, picked up my encrypted laptop, and stowed it securely into my leather tote. I had executed my husband's final request flawlessly. The blood money was secured in a federal vault. The murderers were in custody, and the corrupt enablers were facing their own brutal reckoning. I turned my back on the board of directors and walked out of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing the fate of the trapped executives with Agent Miller. I walked down the carpeted hallway, feeling the adrenaline slowly fade, replaced by a deep, crystalline sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor who had just detonated a federal explosive underneath the people who murdered my husband. I stepped back out into the grand ballroom. The atmosphere had completely inverted. The string quartet had stopped playing. The low hum of corporate networking had shattered into a frantic, chaotic buzz. Security guards were posted at the main exits, and federal agents and windbreakers were directing guests toward the lobby. Word of the dramatic arrests had already ripped through the crowd of hundreds. Everyone knew Connor and Vanessa had been hauled out in handcuffs, and everyone knew I was the one who had orchestrated it. As I walked across the room, the very same people who had physically turned their backs on me just an hour before now stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The crowd parted for me out of sheer fear. They looked at me as if I possessed the power to destroy their lives with a single keystroke. And considering what I had just done to the CFO, they were absolutely right. Before I could reach the grand marble staircase, a cluster of Richard's distant relatives intercepted me. These were the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly consumed Connor's vicious social media video. They had spent the entire evening treating me like a parasitic disease, refusing to offer a single word of condolence for the man I loved. Aunt Meredith, Richard's older sister, stepped forward. Her previously haughty expression had completely melted into a mask of desperate, performative affection. She reached out, her hands fluttering as if she wanted to hug me. "Elena, darling," Meredith gasped, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We are completely in shock. We had no idea what Connor and Vanessa were doing behind our backs. It is simply horrific. You must be so traumatized by this entire ordeal." I stopped walking. I didn't step back, but I didn't allow her to touch me. I simply stared at her outstretched hands until she awkwardly lowered them to her sides. Cousin Bryce, a man who had aggressively badgered Richard for investment capital for years, quickly flanked his mother. "Elena, you have to forgive us," Bryce pleaded, shifting his weight nervously. "Connor fed us a terrible narrative. He manipulated the whole family into believing you were taking advantage of Richard. We were just trying to protect my uncle's legacy. You know how much we love you. We are family, after all." "Family," I repeated. The word tasted incredibly sour. "Yes, of course," Meredith chimed in, stepping closer. "We need to stick together right now. The press is going to have a field day with these arrests. We should coordinate a unified public front. Why don't you come out to our estate in Marin County tonight? We can have some wine, process this terrible betrayal together, and figure out how to handle the media fallout." I looked at the cluster of relatives surrounding me. I saw right through their panicked, greedy calculations. They knew the $50 million had been intercepted by the federal government. But they also knew that with Connor and Vanessa going to prison, I was now the undisputed sole heir to the rest of Richard's vast logistics fortune. The very same people who had gleefully watched me get evicted into the freezing rain were now terrified they were about to be cut out of the multi-billion-dollar will. They wanted access to my wealth, and they were willing to use cheap flattery to secure it. "You don't love me, Meredith," I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute detachment that made her flinch. "You tolerated me because Richard forced you to, and the second he died, you happily joined the mob trying to destroy me." "Elena, please." "That isn't true," Bryce stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "We were victims of Connor's lies, too." "You weren't victims," I corrected sharply. "You were volunteers. When Connor posted that defamatory video this morning, you didn't call me to ask for my side of the story. You didn't offer me a place to sleep when I was illegally thrown out of my house. You clicked the share button, You gossiped with your country club friends. You watched me walk into this ballroom tonight and treated me like a criminal. You chose your side because you thought Connor held the keys to the corporate vault. Meredith's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. We were confused. We were grieving. You were greedy, I shot back. I took a step forward, forcing Meredith and Bryce to physically back up. My grief was real. I spent the last 5 years loving Richard, taking care of him, and fighting for his health. You spent the last 5 years calculating how much of his money you would inherit. You have no right to call me family now that your golden boy is sitting in the back of a federal transport van. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote on my shoulder, standing perfectly tall. This is the last time any of you will ever speak to me, I announced, my voice clear enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. I am establishing absolute no contact with this entire side of the family. If you call my phone, you will be blocked. If you show up at my property, you will be arrested for trespassing. If you attempt to contact me through any channels, my legal team will file harassment charges immediately. Elena, you can't do this, Meredith cried, her facade of politeness dropping to reveal pure panic. You can't just cut us off completely. We are Richard's blood. I can, and I just did, I replied smoothly. Richard knew exactly who you were. He knew you were parasites. That is why he trusted me to execute his final wishes instead of you. I didn't wait for another desperate plea or hollow apology. I walked right past them, descending the grand marble staircase with steady, deliberate steps. I left the sycophants standing in the middle of the ballroom, completely paralyzed by the realization that their access to the logistics empire was permanently severed. They had bet their entire social and financial standing on a pair of murderers, and they had lost everything. As I walked toward the grand lobby doors, I saw other familiar faces trying to catch my eye. Former neighbors, wealthy socialites, and minor shareholders who had snubbed me all evening were now offering tentative plastic smiles. They were testing the waters, trying to gauge if I would accept their silent apologies. I didn't return a single glance. I kept my chin high, navigating the sea of sudden admirers with the exact same cold indifference they had shown me in my darkest hour. A concierge pulled the heavy brass doors open. I stepped out into the San Francisco night. The freezing, aggressive rain from the night before had completely stopped. The sky had cleared, revealing a brilliant, crisp canopy of stars above the city skyline. The cool, clean air filled my lungs, washing away the suffocating scent of the hotel ballroom. I walked down the quiet, wet pavement. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a secure text from Agent Miller, confirming that Vanessa and Connor were officially booked into federal holding, and the depository transfer was fully verified. The nightmare was truly over. I didn't feel a sudden rush of euphoria. Healing doesn't happen instantly. I had a massive hole in my heart where my husband used to be, and I knew the grief would hit me in terrifying waves over the coming weeks. But as I hailed a cab to take me to a safe, comfortable hotel, I felt an undeniable sense of peace. I had faced the most toxic, manipulative forces in my life, and I had utterly crushed them. I settled into the backseat of the cab, resting my head against the cold glass. The city lights blurred past, painting the dark interior with flashes of gold and white. I was totally exhausted, but completely reborn. The war was decisively over. Now my true journey was finally beginning. The morning after the confrontation at the hotel hit the national news networks. The spectacular downfall of the logistics empire's heirs dominated the financial press. But while the media feasted on the scandalous arrests of Connor and Vanessa, my focus shifted entirely to a much quieter, methodical battlefield. I had to navigate the California probate courts to claim the clean, rightful inheritance Richard had actually intended for me. The emergency court order Vanessa had forged was still technically on the books, effectively blocking my access to the Pacific Heights estate and my marital assets. I needed to dismantle it legally and wipe the public slate completely clean. I hired Eleanor Hastings, a heavyweight probate litigator renowned for her absolute intolerance of corporate bullying. Unlike Sterling, Eleanor was a legal surgeon. We walked into the San Francisco County Courthouse exactly 3 weeks later. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy with procedural anticipation. The media was barred from entry, leaving only the hollow echo of polished mahogany and the stern presence of Judge Harmon. This was the exact same Judge Sterling had woken up at 2 a.m. to sign the fraudulent eviction order. Judge Harmon was furious, utterly humiliated that his court had been weaponized to facilitate a federal conspiracy. Eleanor presented our case with terrifying precision. She laid out the forensic timeline I had compiled in that freezing motel room. She provided Agent Miller's sworn affidavit, confirming the $50 million wire transfer was a secure evidence deposit requested by the DOJ, not an act of theft by a desperate widow. Furthermore, Eleanor produced the actual, binding will Richard had drafted and notarized 2 years prior. It was a pristine document untouched by Vanessa's manipulation. The will explicitly stated that the Pacific Heights estate, the primary checking accounts, and a substantial, clean stock portfolio were left entirely to me. Opposing counsel, a frantic junior partner assigned to represent the now incarcerated Connor, offered practically no resistance. Their entire legal strategy had evaporated the second Vanessa was indicted for wire fraud. They attempted a pathetic plea for a deferred settlement, arguing that the logistics company's assets needed to be separated from the personal estate. Eleanor shut them down instantly, citing the ironclad prenuptial protections Richard had specifically established to shield my assets from corporate liability. Judge Harmon didn't hesitate. He quashed the ex parte court order with extreme prejudice. He formally reinstated my full access to all marital accounts and officially recognized me as the sole, legitimate executor of Richard's personal estate. The gavel fell, echoing in the empty gallery. In under 45 minutes, the legal nightmare was completely eradicated. I walked out of the courthouse with my head held high, holding the certified court orders, proving my absolute innocence to the world. My first destination wasn't a celebratory dinner. It was Pacific Heights. I instructed my private driver to navigate the familiar, winding streets toward the mansion. The iron gates swung open smoothly as the new security team I had hired recognized my vehicle. I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway. The manicured lawns and blooming hydrangeas Richard and I had planted together looked exactly the same, but the energy of the estate had completely shifted. It was no longer a crime scene. It was a reclaimed sanctuary. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door using a new set of brass keys. The grand foyer was silent, bathed in soft afternoon sunlight filtering through the stained glass. The household staff, the very same employees who had accepted Vanessa's bribes to sign fake affidavits against me, had already been permanently terminated and replaced. The house felt incredibly clean, completely purged of the toxic sycophants who had hovered around Richard in his final days. I walked slowly through the sprawling rooms. I ran my hand along the polished banister, feeling a profound sense of ownership. I wasn't a guest here. I wasn't a gold digger occupying space I hadn't earned. I had fought a brutal war against ruthless corporate predators to protect this house and the memory of the man who bought it. I walked into the private dining room. The floor where Richard had collapsed was spotless. The painful memory of his last moments rushed back, threatening to steal my breath. But I didn't look away. I faced the memory head-on. I had honored his final command. I had protected his legacy from the scavengers. I had secured the evidence that would keep his murderers locked in a federal penitentiary for decades. The clean inheritance resting in my bank accounts wasn't blood money. It was the rightful conclusion to a life built on integrity. I made my way to the master suite and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. The view of the San Francisco skyline stretched out before me, vast and full of limitless possibilities. My financial independence was fully restored. I possessed the resources and the brilliant forensic mind to dictate my own future. Connor and Vanessa were currently trading their tailored designer suits for standard-issue prison jumpsuits, while the sycophantic relatives who had shunned me begged for relevance in a social circle that had moved on without them. The public narrative had completely inverted. The very same media outlets that had eagerly published Connor's defamatory video were now running extensive profiles on my background. They highlighted my past career as a top-tier forensic accountant, detailing how my unparalleled financial expertise had single-handedly exposed a massive corporate homicide conspiracy. I was no longer perceived as the opportunistic, helpless widow. I was universally recognized as a lethal adversary who had outmaneuvered a billion-dollar fraud ring. My reputation was absolutely bulletproof. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. I opened my personal laptop, the same machine that had executed the flawless digital trap. I logged into my newly restored banking portal. The accounts were active, secure, and flush with clean, undisputed capital. But looking at the staggering numbers, I knew my work wasn't entirely finished. Healing from this level of profound betrayal required more than just securing my own comfort. It required action. It required taking the immense power I now wielded and using it to ensure nobody else was crushed by the kind of predatory greed that had temporarily destroyed my life. I stared at the screen, my mind already outlining the framework for a new enterprise. The grief would always remain as a silent shadow in my heart, but the fire in my veins burned brighter than ever. I was ready to build an empire of my own. The very next morning, I contacted Eleanor Vance and instructed her to draft the incorporation documents for a new nonprofit organization. I endowed the project with $10 million of my clean inheritance. I called it the Richard Shield Foundation. Its mission was highly specific and aggressively executed. We provided elite forensic accountants, ruthless probate litigators, and private investigators dedicated to vulnerable elders and widows, actively facing financial exploitation from predatory family members. I knew exactly how terrifying it felt to be stripped of all resources and thrown onto the street by greedy relatives wielding forged legal documents. I swore I would never let another woman or elder in the United States face that nightmare alone. Within 6 months, the foundation was operating at full capacity. We took on complex cases that standard legal aid clinics simply didn't have the financial literacy to process. I personally oversaw the forensic audits. My team dismantled abusive conservatorships, tracked down stolen retirement funds hidden in offshore crypto wallets, and dragged thieving, arrogant relatives into federal courtrooms. Every time we handed a restored bank account back to a tearful grandmother or secured a permanent restraining order for a terrified widow, I felt another fracture in my own grieving heart heal. I was using the exact same skills that saved my life to become an unbreakable shield for others in desperate need. While my new life flourished, the architects of my misery faced their absolute ruin. The federal trial of Connor and Vanessa concluded swiftly. Agent Miller had built an impenetrable case using the digital roadmap I provided. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the DOJ depository trap and the Belize money trail, their expensive defense attorneys advised them to take a plea deal. Vanessa was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Connor received 20 years as a willing accomplice and co-conspirator. The logistics empire purged them from its history, completely rebranding under new leadership to survive the PR nightmare. Sterling, the slick probate lawyer who had tried to intimidate me, was permanently disbarred and indicted for his role in the fraudulent eviction. As for the distant relatives who had shunned me in that grand hotel ballroom, they faded into total obscurity. My strict no-contact order remained a flawless, impenetrable wall. Occasionally, I would see an email from Aunt Meredith or Cousin Bryce trapped in my spam folder, begging for a meeting or a small loan to cover their mounting debts. I deleted them without reading past the subject line. They had pledged their loyalty to toxic greed, and they were paying the ultimate price, with total social and financial irrelevance. A year to the day after Richard passed away, I drove out to the cemetery. The biting cold of that terrible San Francisco night was a distant memory, replaced by the soft warmth of a bright, clear California spring. The sprawling cemetery was quiet, filled with the gentle rustle of ancient oaks and the distant chirping of robins. I walked down the manicured stone path, my heels clicking softly against the pavement until I reached his resting place. The polished granite headstone gleamed beautifully in the afternoon sun. I knelt down and placed a fresh bouquet of white hydrangeas at the base of the stone. They were the exact same flowers we had planted together in the front yard of our Pacific Heights home. I traced the engraved letters of his name with my fingertips. "We did it, Richard," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the crushing panic that had consumed me a year prior. "The company is clean. The foundation is thriving. I made sure they could never hurt anyone ever again." I sat on the warm grass for a long time, simply enjoying the profound stillness. There was a time when I thought losing Richard would break me completely. I thought my entire identity was wrapped up in being his wife, in building a peaceful sanctuary away from the brutal corporate world I had left behind. But sitting there in the sun, I realized the sanctuary was never the house. The sanctuary was my own mind. Richard had known that. He had seen my strength long before I was forced to wield it. He trusted me with the $50 million trap because he knew I was the only person ruthless and brilliant enough to spring it perfectly without hesitation. I stood up and brushed the grass off my tailored black slacks. I took one last look at the grave, feeling a deep, enduring peace settle over my soul. I was no longer the hunted victim, fleeing a manufactured eviction. I was a fiercely independent, wealthy, powerful woman who had stared down a syndicate of corporate murderers and emerged completely victorious. The greatest protection a woman can possess is not relying on the wealth or status of someone else. It is the absolute, unshakable ability to stand on your own 2 feet when the entire world collapses around you. It is the power to look at those who try to destroy you, recognize their weaknesses, and dismantle their empires with cold, calculated precision. I walked slowly down the long stone path toward my waiting luxury car, stepping confidently out of the dark shadows of the cemetery and directly into the bright, sunlit future I had secured for myself. I was completely free. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute edge by toxic people who call themselves family, only to use your own intelligence to make them pay the ultimate price? Have you ever had to build a fortress out of your own resilience? Share your story in the comments below right now. When Richard died, the protective bubble of Elena's comfortable life shattered instantly. The very people who should have supported her, her stepson and his wife, became her most ruthless predators. If Elena had been nothing more than the dependent wife they assumed she was, she would have been completely crushed under the weight of their forged court orders and cruel manipulation. Instead, she survived because she had built her own internal fortress. The ultimate lesson of this intense story is that your greatest defense mechanism is your own competence, intellect, and self-reliance. Wealth, social status, and even the fierce protection of a loving partner can be stripped away in a matter of hours. But the skills you build, the resilience you continuously forge, and the boundaries you firmly set are untouchable. Elena didn't defeat a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy by relying on Richard's money. She won by weaponizing her own background as a forensic auditor and absolutely refusing to be a passive victim. It reminds us powerfully that true empowerment means having the ability to save yourself when all other safety nets fail. Life will inevitably test your foundation, often through the very people you are supposed to trust the most. When that happens, you must be ready to become your own absolute savior. If you found yourself nodding along to this lesson, I challenge you to take one step today toward building your own unshakable independence, and share your journey with us in the comments below.